Thanks for joining us. And this is the end of the first week of the physics track of our summer school. And you are the first of a new thing we're sort of trying, which is doing Q&As with very interesting people. And
thank you.
And in fact, beyond that, the kind of structure we're hoping for is that maybe we can start off with me kind of asking you some things about background and so on, and then people are welcome to put questions in the chat and maybe ask them in person as well. But so let me just give a little bit of an introduction to Bob. So Bob, for people who don't know it, has been a big person in the whole effort to sort of how should I call it, diagrammatify quantum mechanics or something. I have Bob's book here with its about picturing quantum processes, which is actually as thick as a bunch of books I've written, and it's full of pictures that are probably to many people at least as bizarre as the pictures that are in books of mine. By the way, does that dodo have a name, Bob?
I mean, the reason we picked the dodo was because it's like 50 meters from our office. There is like the only dodo remnants.
Yes,
all the genetic material is in Oxford in the museum there, you know, which was 50 meters from our office. So there's the one donut, the one dodo which remains.
Let's hope that our theories and efforts survive better than just to have one little dried out foot, so to speak, yeah, exactly. A few hundred years from now.
Exactly.
But so I'm curious, Bob. I mean, what you are best known for, to us at least, is this kind of formalism for quantum mechanics that involves diagrams and category theory and so on. But I'm curious, how did you get to doing this? What was it? You were at first an ordinary physicist, is that true, or were you never an ordinary physicist, so to speak?
I mean, I started as an engineer actually, and I think this helped me a lot in my career. So I started as an engineer, and the reason I started as an engineer was really stupid. I came from a little village and was very political, and I thought, and nobody listened to me, and I thought the only reason people are going to listen to me is if I studied the most difficult thing ever, which was in Belgium engineering, because you had to do a special exam to actually get into the university. I was actually pretty crap at school, by the way, because I didn't care, to be honest. But it was sort of politics got me like to make an effort. Then I had to do some sort of internship, and I thought the real world was really boring. So, and then I moved to physics and maths together. I did physics and math together, and then part of the reason I went to physics was because my quantum mechanics course in engineering, I hated it. And then I got this idea, I hate it. So maybe I should change it.
Why did they teach quantum mechanics to engineers? Were they?
It was a standard course in the second year.
So, in the future, with all this quantum computing stuff, maybe they will be teaching quantum mechanics to engineers. But back in the day, I'm not sure why they would have been doing it.
I think it was about understanding lasers and stuff. Maybe it was connected to the university I was, because they had a big laser physics department or something like that. So it was about understanding lasers and stuff, I think. To be honest, like my first year courses, I loved in engineering. They were much better than the first year courses in maths and physics, because in Belgium, engineering was much more higher regarded than doing physics or maths.
What kind of engineering? What kind of engineering was the big kind?
First year it was all together. Second, so my idea was to do physical engineering, but then I actually switched to architecture. Because there was a combined degree of building engineer and architecture. And I was also some sort of artist. So I actually moved, but then I had to do some internship, and then I gave totally up on the outside world. I became an academic. So I went back to physics and maths, like
although you're now back about to be in the gravitational attraction of a large engineering company.
Exactly. So it's exactly.
So what was the engineering company that you did your internship in? What kind of engineering did you do?
Just some building company, like I mean, and then you have to start talking to people about like their wishes about your architecture and stuff, and how you design stuff. And I said, shit, this is not artistic. There's no art going on here. So I went back to the science thing. And then at that time, I kind of because I hated the course of quantum physics in engineering, I kind of said, there's something wrong here. There should be something more fundamental going on there. There should be something nicer to do. And really, from when I started studying my undergrad in physics and maths, I had this idea, I'm going to change quantum mechanics.
Okay.
I mean, maybe many people have this idea, but to some extent, actually, I kind of succeeded in a little bit in at least doing that. Because I hear.
So did you go on and sort of do quantum mechanics for your PhD and things like that?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, my PhD was in a foundation. I mean, my PhD, because I mean, PhDs, you depend on supervisors, you know. I mean, usually, so I did my PhD on hidden variables, and then I was unemployed.
But so what kind of formalism did you use for your PhD?
So we start. So the thing I did, like I built some theory about like contextual hidden variables, and it was pretty much saying that anything that if you want to understand it in quantum mechanics in a sort of causal way, classical causal way, you can do it if you want it. The main problem with that thing was it didn't teach you anything. It was sort of, I mean, you know, these people, the Bohmians and all of these people, you know, these Bohmian mechanics and all that, and all these people
yes.
very obsessed about things. I mean, what I saw there, it's like whatever they are doing is actually trivial, but it doesn't teach you anything.
But I'm just curious, the kind of formalism, because I mean, things like the Cochin-Specker theorem and all these various kinds of ways to home in on what is the essence of something.
I went back to basic measure theory. It was very foundational. It was basic set theory, measure theory, very naive, but just going all the way down. See, can you build things up from like a set theoretic level to explain things causally if you want to, if you just bring in the idea that there are some variables in the measurement context. I mean, this was not my initial idea. This idea went back to an idea by Constantin Piron and Gisin. They had some paper where they actually had some model for like qubit measurements, where they actually put a variable in the measurement context, and then you actually explain things deterministically. You can do this. And so this was just for qubits. So, and then my supervisor, he was obsessed with that idea. So I generalized this to infinite dimensions and all that. And it basically showed that an idea like that doesn't buy you anything. It just says, okay, you can do it. So what?
Does it end up grinding into sort of the details of set theory and all kinds of elaborate sort of transfinite things?
It doesn't buy you anything. I mean, there's a few questions. There's a few questions about how much cardinality do you need, like in the context relative to your system description. Probably there's some more interesting things to be said there, but that's really all there was. That's really all there was.
But what I'm curious about, in you know, normally in physics, you know, a lot of physics, like ordinary quantum mechanics, is basically 19th century mathematics. And I'm curious whether the things you were doing were kind of solid 20th century set theory, or whether it was sufficient to use kind of.
I mean, the sort of books I read was like books of lattice theory of Birkhoff and stuff like that, and that the theorems I used were all 20th century theorems.
Right.
Yeah, it was all 20th century mathematics. I can't remember the names because it's so long ago, but it was generally 20th century discrete mathematics.
Interesting. In
that word. But the main point is, it didn't teach me anything. I said, okay, now I can live the rest of my life with the idea that if we want quantum theory to be sort of deterministic, we can have it. And we can have any other theory to be deterministic if you want to, but it doesn't bring anything new to the picture. It's just like some sort of comfort. It's like a sofa. Okay, if that's how I like to think about the world, then I can think about the world like that. But it doesn't teach me anything. So it was kind of a very negative result for me.
So you said then you got your PhD in hidden variables, and then nobody wanted to hire you to do hidden variables.
Yeah, I was unemployed. I mean, nobody wanted to hire anybody who wasn't doing string theory, and definitely there was not a single job for anybody outside string theory. Like, I'm not talking about faculty, I'm talking about postdoc.
What year was this?
95-ish.
Oh, okay. But
nothing else.
So, I mean, the foundations of quantum mechanics at that point, nobody cared about them. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I mean, there was a bunch of people who cared about them. Interpretations and mostly in philosophy department, they were just screaming at each other.
But what about
there's political camps against each other, and and I think the field got destroyed in that way.
But I mean, there was already the beginnings of quantum computing. I mean, people, back in the 1980s.
That was starting, but that was like in IBM, like in companies like Bennett and IBM, Chris Fuchs, people like that. They were at IBM.
Well, there were people like David Deutsch in Oxford, but he was a little bit.
That was kind of like hippie place, That was. I mean, if you listen to the story of somebody like Richard Josa, who, like, the first algorithm there was Deutsch-Josa, David Deutsch and Richard Josa. So Richard Josa was trained as a category theoretician.
Okay.
Tuples theory. He had like a horrible career path. He actually had children when he was doing his PhD, like lots of, and he was horrible. Like he talked to me about that. And then he ended up meeting David Deutsch, and then they came up with this algorithm, and then things went well for him. But also him. I mean, he wasn't great. Like it was a very long time before actually any physics department hired the first person in quantum computing. It took a very long time before that happened. I think this was well in the 2000s. And I can't remember exactly, but it was very well in 2000 before. And just all the, like Chris Fuchs and lots of these people, they were all working at IBM and Howard Barman, like the lab, these names in the US, the government labs and stuff like that.
Yeah, right. No, I remember when
Los Alamos and stuff like that. That's where these people were working. That's where they were doing it. There were a few people, of course, there was people like Arthur Eckert, but he was in Oxford. So Oxford was a very good place initially then to do these sort of things.
But when was there a connection made? I mean, there had been the foundations of quantum mechanics crowd that had gone in the philosophy direction. And there was also, I remember from the beginning of the 1980s, there were people talking about, computers were obviously important, and there were physicists thinking about how would you physicalize computers. When did those two things start to merge? Was that much later that
I think that intellectually it merged already together then, like with people like Benioff and all that, like Yuri Mining was.
I don't think so. I knew. I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, because I knew Paul Benioff back when I was a summer visitor at Argonne National Lab back when he was doing his quantum computing stuff, and he was very much of a we know there are computers and we know that they operate with bits and semiconductors and things. How would we formulate this in terms of Hamiltonians and quantum mechanics?
Okay, I see your question now. Like real connecting up the physics and the.
I think that's much more recent, isn't it?
Must be, but what do you mean by physics? Like, because you're now saying Hamiltonians.
No, I'm saying that the people thinking about making computers quantum mechanical versus the people thinking about the foundations of quantum mechanics. Those seem to have merged only quite recently.
I think so. To some extent, I think it was like an opportunism by young people from quantum foundations who basically didn't see any career opportunities except for declaring themselves like quantum computing people. I mean, I was one of them. lots of done that. I mean, and you've got like the people like Rob Speckens and a lot of this new wave of quantum foundations. They all did that. So like with quantum computing, they got quantum computing jobs while they were still interested in foundations and all that. That's what they all did. I mean, I was the first professor of quantum foundations in the world. The first one.
You. Okay.
Wait. I mean, I'm not in a computer science department.
Okay. That's even bigger trick.
That's what makes it interesting. That's the bit which makes it interesting. The second one was the second one was Czeslaw Bruckner in Vienna, where Zeilinger's lab and all that. So he was the second one, because these people have been doing like foundational physics and all that. So it's very interesting that the first person in the world, professor of quantum foundations, was in a computer science department.
That is interesting. So, okay, so I want to know more about your trajectory. So 1995, you're an unemployed hidden variables quantum person, right? So what happened next?
I tried to redefine myself as a logician, mathematician. So I managed to get some sort of, I mean, the system in Belgium is very similar to France. If you know, you get some government sort of fellowships, and I managed to get one in maths, in logic. Because before that I was purely a trained physicist. So I learned a little bit of logic. I started getting category theory and stuff like that through connections with Louvain-la-Neuve, where Borseux, there was a big category theory group there. And then again, it kind of ended. So they
but what kind of logic was this?
Oh, it came out of quantum logic. So my academic grandfather is Constantin Piron, who's like one of the big fathers of quantum logic. So
what is the history of that? I mean, so von Neumann was talking about quantum logics, but is that the same lineage as the quantum logic you're talking about, or is that?
Totally. So von Neumann declared in 1935. It's a very interesting story for everybody who's listening here. Like von Neumann declared in 1935, 3 years after he published his book, which is still the standard quantum formalism, that he hated it. So what von Neumann went up to do after that was like all the C-star algebra stuff, the von Neumann algebra stuff, and a lot of all this maths work he did, which is completely changed math, was actually looking for a new quantum formalism.
Why did von Neumann think? I mean, he did his whole development in terms of sort of traditional, I don't know, eigenvalue operator theory and things like this of his original quantum mechanics book. So why did he come to hate it? What was he doing around that time? That was around the time of Gödel's theorem. It was around the time when mathematical logic was getting people were getting enthusiastic about it.
So definitely, like intuitionistic logic had an impact on that. Like the traditional laws of logic were being challenged. Like, of course, there was Brouwer and all these schools. And then that's why he came up initially with this idea with Birkhoff, like, okay, clearly quantum mechanics seems to say something different. It's not about like a excluded middle. It's, well, that's part of it, but it's also about like distributivity seems to break down too. Because, I mean, basically, okay, when you kill distributivity, you kill deduction. You got nothing left. So that program ultimately led to nothing, and even von Neumann himself abandoned this very quickly, although he had been pushing for it for a while, this quantum logic program. And then he went to look. I know he was obsessed at some point. I mean, I don't know the details, but he was obsessed at some point with type 2 factors for reasons we don't understand. I don't understand.
What are these called?
Type 2 factors of von Neumann algebra.
What are those?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, you have to. You should have asked my academic. I mean, he's dead now, unfortunately, von Jones. But he's my academic cousin, von Jones. He could explain all that stuff to me. Unfortunately,
no,
he died.
I didn't know von Jones. I mean, I knew him somewhat. I mean, he's famous for things in knot theory and so on. What was his? How did he?
He started his PhD with Piron.
Aha.
It comes from quantum logic. Is my nephew, academic nephew.
How did he get from quantum logic to knot theory?
So he was doing, he didn't finish his PhD in quantum logic. He was kind of a wild guy when he was younger. And that's partly what kind of got him in the end, I think. But yeah, I mean, he didn't finish, and then he wanted to do something else. And then university, as far as I remember, University of Geneva didn't support him anymore, so he had to move elsewhere. But still, I remember meeting him regularly in Piron's office when I was going there as a PhD student. He was a very funny guy. I mean, at that time, nobody knew him.
Right.
He was kind of, we were kids. But he was a very interesting, I only met him recently. Then I didn't meet him for like 10, 15 years. And then I met him at Harvard at some event. And it was like, it was really nice to meet each other again. Like, but yeah, not too long after that, he unfortunately died. I mean, he looked very bad at that time already. But yeah, so he came from that. So another person who came from exactly the same school is Ingrid Dobeschies.
I know her too. Yes.
She came exactly from the same school group with Piron.
Okay.
So it's kind of funny that there was like this.
So you went into pictorial quantum mechanics. Ingrid Dobeschies invented wavelets, and Vaughan Jones did the Jones polynomial.
Yeah,
that's a good diverse set of outcomes.
We came from the same quantum logic source. So
Wow.
nothing what we did had anything to do with that anymore. I mean, I probably stayed the closest in a way.
Yes, I would say so. Of those, if I were to pick for those three. But so what were the questions then? And when you were doing quantum logic, what were the things that people?
So another person who was there was Nicolas Gisin. I don't know whether you know. He's one of the top quantum experimentalists. He's in Geneva still.
I've seen the name. Yeah.
Yeah, he's at the level of Zeiling experimentally. He's like in that category. Like he's one of the people sometimes considered for Nobel Prize and stuff like that. So he's very big. So he was also from there, and some of the work they did there, Dobuchy too, was on trying to understand the tensor product in quantum mechanics. Where does it come from? Can we conceptually justify why we combine systems in this way and not like classically? I mean, and all the sort of formalisms people came up with, like, be it like quantum logics, all these alternative formalisms pushed by von Neumann's desire to have an alternative formalism, they couldn't reproduce the tensor product. They couldn't reproduce the way we combine systems. So you can find papers by Gisin on that. You can find papers by Dobuchy on that. Really, all these people wrote about that sort of stuff, the problem with the tensor product in quantum mechanics. And so my idea ultimately at some point was like, let's not construct it, let's assume it.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to work on that in the late 90s, and the breakthrough was basically like using diagrams. That's when you implicitly just assume there is a thing, you put two wires side by side, that's a tensor product, and that's all you say about it. And then you start putting in cups and caps and stuff like that, and it implicitly starts defining your structure. So you basically take your composition as the number one. So the failure of describing the tensor product in quantum logic is what got me to say, we need to come up with a formalism where the tensor is the number one citizen. You don't talk about your systems, you don't say what your systems is. So the tensor product is the only thing you can care about, like how things compose. It's sort of very relational, very holistic, whatever. I mean, there's lots of word philosophers came up about doing that stuff. But so it actually, so that sort of thing, which all these people worked on, like Gisin and Dobuchy's, and got nowhere because the whole, I mean, I can explain. I don't want to go here there because there is a reason why all that stuff failed. And the reason all that stuff failed, it goes back to Poincaré, basically.
Explain that. Yeah, why?
So people like Piron and this old generation coming from that sort of Geneva school, which went back, by the way, which went back to what's his name, like the one who taught Feynman diagrams. What's his name again?
John Wheeler?
No.
Julian Schwinger?
Baron from.
Oh yes. Stuckelberg.
Baron from Stuckelberg. So he was Piron's supervisor. So he was Piron's supervisor. He was, and so he's the one basically kind of told Feynman about Feynman diagrams, and Feynman actually admits this even, like, yeah, the master told me. He says this somewhere. The master told me. So of course, this was a very, very foundational deep school, because there was this totally rich guy who didn't care about academics and careers and stuff like that, and just made people be like very serious.
From all accounts, he was a very colorful character.
He was a very colorful. I mean, Piron was a very colorful character too. I can tell you that. Like, so I grew up among colorful characters. Like, but yeah, so it was very foundational. I mean, to the extent that I wasn't allowed to publish in any normal journal like PRL or stuff like that, because this was all selling out.
Oh yeah, what were the true journals?
Helvetica Physica Acta doesn't exist anymore.
So that's where Stuckelberg published
the local Swiss Stuckelberg journal. That was a good journal. So if you look at my career, like in the beginning, I published there. It's really crazy. So
you were saying that the mistake that goes back to Poincaré, what was that?
Okay. So So they were very serious about things, and they believed, of course, that, I mean, the Francophone culture played a role there too. And Poincaré was this big hero, and Poincaré had this like le science et l'hypothèse, setting out the philosophy, out the science of the 20th century, because this was the beginning of the 20th century should be. And there was this dogma about there is no way you can talk about anything if you don't put it in a box. If you don't talk about an isolated system, which was, of course, a very important statement, like if you don't want any interactions with the outside world. So this was an obsession almost, like this isolated system thing. So the way they set up their logic, their quantum logic, was about like, we assign propositions to systems and there is no interference from the outside world. Now, the way I believe now that what quantum theory tells us is that's an illusion. We have to come up with new, I think, obviously it's built in our formulas. We have to come up with new ways to formulate that Mars is not going to affect whatever I'm doing here in the lab without having to assume that everything we describe is in a box. We have to do things, we have to learn to do science about things which are not in a box. But the whole quantum logic was set up such that it was only talking about stuff which is inside a box.
I don't think, I think that goes a lot earlier than Poincaré. I mean, from the whole Bacon.
Of course. I mean, that's Galilei, of course, and stuff like that.
The very idea that one can do an isolated experiment is a foundational idea from sort of the traditional scientific method, and it may be not true, but it's a sort of important idealization. But I'm curious. So you're saying in the quantum logic tradition, does this appear like as an axiom in quantum logic that it is possible?
Everything is pure by default, and the way it's set up, quantum logic is set up, is really everything is propositional. And the way I think about it is like, it's a long time since I thought about it. I thought about this really hard 20 years ago when I was employed and stuff like that. But I understood that like there's one nice paper by a guy called David Moore, one of the people who's not in academia anymore, who's much smarter than me. He writes a very nice paper about the analysis of quantum logic and the importance of this hypothesis of isolated systems and all that. And it's clear you put, mathematics is not good taking something outside of a box once you put it inside a box. That's not how maths works. You know that maths doesn't work like that. And I think that's what killed quantum logic. That's what killed quantum logic, because they were talking about stuff inside a box. Now we know that, for me, the most interesting thing about quantum mechanics is actually the fact that you don't stick things in a box. You let them roam free. You let them interact and all that. And that's clearly all the stuff. I come from this culture where I came from Brussels school. That's another. So in one end, I was in Geneva. On the other side, I was in Brussels. Who was in Brussels like Prigogine? So we had a Nobel Prize next door. So you were indoctrinated.
Yes, I interacted with Prigogine a bit. He was I would say of a certain. What can I say? He had a certain more organizational flair, perhaps, than scientific flair. He was. I never really believed his dissipative structures stuff, which talking of lineages of things. He got that from Turing. That was the whole, Turing reaction diffusion story.
And he was very frustrated that he got a chemistry Nobel Prize, not a physics one.
Well, okay, that's some. So what was his influence on? He didn't seem like. He talked about foundations of thermodynamics, but he didn't seem to get involved in quantum mechanics.
His influence was pretty much that anything I was taught in my curriculum as a physicist was nonlinear dynamics.
Okay.
I developed a disgust for that.
Okay, fair enough. Well, good. Then it's good you're working on quantum mechanics, which has some linearity properties.
Yes, exactly. So one of the beautiful things was at some point there was an event in Brussels, 95. It was like Piron and Prigogine were both there. They were basically killing each other. Two old men, too close to die, like on the stage killing each other, which was very, but they kind of drove me away. So it kind of impacts your personality if you got people like that around all the time. Those
Okay,
sort
so what happened next? So you were doing quantum logic in you embedded yourself in a quantum logic world. Then that
was
you
in all
decided.
this, yeah, so it was all very confused. There was chaos going on from Prigozhin. Couldn't get a job. I completely gave up, and I applied to the Arts Institute of Chicago for a position in art, because I was an artist too. I failed then, and then I think
in pure art or in some art that relates to mathematics or something.
Well, it was a combination of music and maths. I was doing music and maths, like I was doing stuff with computers and all that. And then suddenly I got like, I'd never ever anything to do with computer science ever in my life. And then I got like an email from Samson Abramsky, do you want the 7-month postdoc?
Okay.
That's how things then suddenly changed. So I went to computer science, and then I suddenly learned that these people had been thinking about like composing systems and stuff like that. Like after this whole frustration with quantum logic, didn't know how to compose systems. Suddenly, as the computer scientists, they just compose them and they take monoidal category. They take some monoidal category and they say, okay, there's a monoidal product, and we compose stuff.
So what was the lineage? So Samson Abramsky was in computer science in Oxford, is that right?
Yeah. He was a Strachey professor.
What's that?
Strachey professor, after Christopher Strachey.
Oh, okay. So in Oxford, there'd been this programming research group that had been doing kind of mathematical theory of programming languages. Is that kind of the tradition that came out of?
Yes, Dana Scott was there too.
Yes.
Oh, Dana. It was a small computer science department, a small department, but there was some lineage like Dana Scott, Strachey, Tony Hoare, like Gauguin.
Can I ask was Abramsky at that point, was he in the sort of chief theoretic phase? Because that doesn't strike me as
That's much later.
So just to understand that history, because I think people might be curious about it. I remember, because I grew up in Oxford, so I actually remember visiting the programming research group when it was a little tiny.
Which years were that?
What's that?
Which years were that? Because that's interesting for me.
Well, I visited there. I remember that the first computer I saw was when I was like 10 years old. That was 1970. And the person who, for various reasons, took me to see that computer was a guy called Joe Stoy, who was a person who worked with...
He was still in the department when I arrived.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So and then subsequently, I never really had serious interaction with the programming research group there, but I think it must have been, that's right. I knew Dana Scott, and he'd been working on denotational semantics, which was his kind of mathematical theory of programming languages.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happened back in 1980 or so, I had developed my first programming language, computer language, this thing called SMP. And so I asked Dana, I said, what's the point of denotational semantics? And he says, it's this general theory of programming languages. And so I said, okay, great. Let me show you this language that we've developed, because, how does it fit in with your general theory of languages? And he looks at it and he says, it doesn't fit in. So it's like, what does this mean? What kind of a theory is this? I have a language, you have a general theory of programming languages. How can it not fit your theory of programming languages? And I've known Dana fairly well for many years now, and he's been a big user of our technology and done all kinds of interesting things with it. And every time I ask him about denotational semantics or Scott domains or any of these kinds of things, he says, oh, that's very complicated stuff. You don't want to know about that. So I've never really learned about that. But that was, but I don't know, and I'm curious about. I was aware of Dana Scott and his kind of denotational semantics, and then there are these things like process algebra, which I've never learned about, which I think originated from, if I understand it, originated within that group. Is that right? Or how did that?
You had like a Cambridge camp and an Oxford. I think they had two different names. One was Tony Hoare and the other one was Robin Miller, I think.
Okay.
And they were different ones. concurrent communicating CCP, and then there was another one. There was the Oxford one and the Cambridge one. But I think these things are all vanishing. They've all vanished.
Yeah.
Because they were incredibly complicated and cumbersomely, the notation was horrible.
But so why did these people, the thing I'm a little bit confused by, this was all happening in the 1960s to 1970s, I think, the origination of these kinds of distributed computing models and so on. And I don't quite know why they were doing that. I mean, there was early thinking about parallel computation. Was that what led these people to do this? I mean, was it a sort of practical thing, or was it something that came out of some mathematical idea?
I mean, I'm sure like a lot of that stuff became practical and has been used even, but
only a bit, I think.
Ultimately, like with people like Gordon Plotkin coming around, they basically said, all this syntactic stuff is so ugly, let's start doing category theory. And that's when people, I think Plotkin was the first one to push this idea. Milner jumped on this boat. Abramsky was one of the early ones too, to jump on the category theory boat. And then things became like actually cleaner. And then actually computer science starts to reach a level that some of the stuff they are doing actually becomes useful to other sciences too.
But so
algebra was completely useless.
But so the early stage was the Tony Hoare, Robin Milner kind of theory of parallel computation, and an attempt to, and a rather, a fairly complicated set of primitives that would be ways of communicating between what you're now describing as, I mean, because when you describe these sort of two wires or something, or two systems, that's a story of things happening in parallel.
Yes, exactly.
And so what you say about the sort of early, the Tony Hoare, Robin Milner stuff is they were trying to model somehow actual sort of things in a computer where messages were being sent from one process to another. Was that the kind of thing?
Yes, yeah. It was like, I mean, some of that stuff became very useful in security, for example, as far as I know, like a person like Bill Roscoe, like, I mean, they still have companies completely based on this sort of formalisms, and they do encryption and stuff like that. And so this is still useful. But so I'm now talking about like going beyond the syntactic useful to actually the foundationally. I mean, I think the big effort we are doing here, I mean, your team and what I've been interested in is like understanding like interaction in a foundational way.
Yeah.
And those syntactic formalisms never contribute to that.
So let me understand though. So out of that stuff came then process algebra, is that right?
Process algebra, yes.
And then what was the relationship between those kinds of things and the theorem proving traditions and the sort of formal verification of programs?
I think it kind of, I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask this, because this is like before my year. Like I said, I didn't know computer science until 2000 at all. And I mean, in my entire life, I think I got one computer science course, and there they told me what the ENIAC was or something like that. Seriously, I was a professor of computer science for a long time. I got one computer science course in my life.
Sorry, you're ahead of me.
When I arrived at Oxford, like the courses were already like category theory, like processes like Curry Howard and stuff like that, like lambda calculus and combinators and things like that. I mean, that was the courses I first saw in the computer science department in Oxford.
Wow.
Which was a complete new level, So that's okay. That's computer science. It actually looks cool.
Right.
That was I think I can live in this place for a while, and I stayed 20 years. That's what I got. So Abramsky told me, okay, you never did a computer science course in your life, take the lambda calculus course. Okay, and that's kind of cool stuff.
So then, what was the relationship? So I mean, the quantum logic world is sort of connected to certain kinds of mathematical logic, but it is not the same kind of mathematical logic that shows up in things like lambda calculus and combinators and so on. It's really a different branch of mathematics.
Yeah, I think this is now going on also, I think, with what's happening with machine learning and stuff like that. Some of this old propositional stuff, which actually basically goes back to the Greeks, we have to rethink that. And that's not going to play a role anymore. And when you talk about combinators and things, I think we are, personally, I want to actually go beyond that. I want to start like redefining logic purely from a big compositional paradigm, where a world about composition. What is the new kind of logic we're going to derive? It's not going to be about propositions. It's going to be something else. I mean, that's my program for the future. I mean,
Okay.
I know I mean, that's my plan that I'm going to do within CQC like this. I've got I defined a few teams. There's people who are actually implementing stuff on quantum computers, there's people who are developing software. I'm going to come up with new theories. That's my team. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be freer than at university.
Okay, it's good theory.
That's my plan. That's my plan.
So you're reversing, I mean, the kind of Aristotle to Frege kind of tradition of base everything on logic. Your idea is base everything on essentially structure and deduce logic from structure in some way. I
mean, logic is going to mean something else, I think. I actually, there was at some point a Twitter discussion where you mentioned somebody brought up that you mentioned something about XOR and NAND and stuff like that not existing in language. So I mean, I think it's even worse than that. I don't think not exists in language, because the way we actually use not has nothing to do with logical not. When I say I don't want the beer, I don't mean I want the pink elephant, you know. I mean, maybe I want a glass of water, maybe I want a glass of wine. So these things are all completely different. So it's much more embedded in like a notion of context and scope and stuff like that. So for me, the place to start thinking about these things is compositional theory, where you got different sort of arenas which you compose, and sometimes you restrict, sometimes you expand. We have to sort of embrace the fact that we live in a humongous universe, and sometimes we have to go local and not in the way we as humans use it. For example, it's localized to a context. So this should become part of science. Like maths has been built up, here is a space and we stick inside the space and that's it. No, like we work local within something which is part of a bigger space, and we have to be adaptive to the space. We need to develop this kind of maths, and not maths, we need to develop this kind of view on reality. That's what I want to focus on. And I think machine learning, the one thing they did is put the finger on the problem with old stuff like traditional logic, and traditional linguistics is part of the problem there too.
Well, I think one of the things you're perhaps highlighting is, I mean, I very much agree with you that logic in the Aristotle type tradition is a fairly specific idea that is not in a sense a fundamental idea. It is an idea that in its original form was intended to capture certain aspects of how humans think about things. And I'm not sure that it's only a very small part of that story as well. But I think that the question of what the set of all possible theories is, logic is not a good foundation for understanding the set of all possible theories.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a fairly specific idea. But
yeah,
I think
I agree with that.
I mean, the challenge as I see it, and you're bringing in linguistics, one of the challenges is that it's humans who are doing the science and the mathematics. And in a sense, there's this sort of challenge that there's the set of all possible things over here and the set of things that we can think about computing with. And then there's a set of things that we humans actually care about and think about, which are to some extent captured by human language. And one of the challenges is, how do you match those two things up? Because there are many things that you could imagine formally that we humans don't care about, have a very hard time thinking about. Our language captures that subset of things that we tend to be able to think about and to care about. And I mean, my lifelong effort of building computational language is all about kind of trying to capture the essence of what it is about human thinking that can be made sort of computational, and kind of what part of the world of computation do we humans care about? I mean, you say that for example, human language does not map well onto logic, and I agree. I mean, that's logic is a tiny corner of the things that we express in human language. And it's, people in the early days of AI was saying, you know, we'll just encode all of human knowledge as logic, and that was disastrous. It really doesn't work.
Exactly.
But I mean, I guess my question would be, and the thing that I find interesting in what I understand of your approach is, you know, I sort of understand this kind of structural way of building things up. You have some structure, could be combinators, could be symbolic expressions. You're building up a structure, then something is transforming that structure. And, you know, the most common thing that we see is programs that take a structure and progressively transform it. I think in your compositionality concept, a lot of what you're talking about is sort of these parallel threads of history that, I mean, you know, I think the essence of quantum mechanics, I suspect we very much agree about this point, that the essence of quantum mechanics is this fact that you can kind of have these multiple threads of history which become entangled. And I guess my question would be, in understanding, you know, traditional programming has very much been about, you have a function like lambda calculus, for example, you have some function, it applies to something else, it applies to something else. It's a very sequential kind of process. Whereas I think what you're describing is something where multiple threads of computation are happening together, and then you're trying to describe how that works. Is that a fair characterization?
It's the interaction structure. It's the interaction structure. I mean, one has to be careful with some people with multiple threads. Then you may go to the Deutsch sort of multi-world thing, which is additive. I'm talking about multiplicative interaction. So tensor stuff. And what makes, I mean, the reason probably this has not been approached so much in computation is because it's computationally very expensive. When you start thinking about tensoring stuff, it's like, I mean, it becomes humongous very quickly because you're exponentially blowing up stuff. So, I mean, it's that sort of justifies. I mean, for me, the only science which has taken this sort of stuff serious is computer science. Physicists never even thought about this stuff. They were not thinking about these things. I mean, others. I mean, yeah. So computer science, that's such a big thing to bring to the world, but actually, as such a big thing to bring to the world by now, seriously embracing this sort of compositional stuff. At the same time, they have a problem with that because it's basically uncomputable.
But when you think about it in terms of computer science, and I want to home in on what you mean by compositionality and what this whole kind of paradigm is like. But in a sense, you know, in computer science, the branch of computer science that's been dealing with this, if I understand correctly, is distributed computing. I mean, that's the area where people
traditionally now I would say computer science logic or something like that. The last 20 years there are dedicated conferences to all this stuff. I mean,
applied to what?
I mean, it's starting to be applied to everything, hardware, design, and all that. I mean, I'm now part of a new community, which is kind of called Applied Category Theory Community, which is a horrible name. I mean, John Byers is one of the two like major figures there is probably John Byers and me. We are pushing this community for people to actually start thinking in this sort of compositional terms before you actually become obsessed with like the fine structure of like mathematical structures.
But I mean, like John Byers has come to this from a very different angle. I mean, he was a very traditional physicist,
mathematical
field theory.
Very traditional mathematical physicist doing topological quantum field theory.
Eventually, yes.
Where you end up doing exactly the same structures.
Huh. So that was how he came to this. Okay.
Yes, topological quantum field theory, which is a hard area of mathematics exactly because of the computational problems once you throw in all these tensors. So I mean, that's a question for you because I know you're a physicist, and you care about computation. Once you start throwing all these tensors, it becomes horrible computational. So that's why I'm going into quantum computing, because I see no other way out. Like, I believe that this is the future of seeing the world, but computationally, like, we can't just do this on classical computers. There's just no way we're ever going to do this.
Well, I mean, I think there are multiple, that's a different topic perhaps, but I mean, there are multiple traditions that have led to this kind of what you're calling tensors. I mean, there's in the world of, for example, general relativity or particle physics, for that matter,
of course.
there are tensors with many indices. And then people think about contracting these collections of tensors with many indices.
Exactly.
And they say it's really a graph where, it's just a tensor as a node, and then it's got these indices that correspond to edges, and they connect in different ways. And there were a variety of, like, Roger Penrose had a formalism.
I mean, Penrose started all this diagram stuff because of the reason you say.
But so what was the historical connection there? Because, I mean, Roger Penrose did that in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I think. As
70, something 1970.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's what I know from papers.
Okay, yeah, right. I mean, he wasn't, I knew Roger Penrose back in like mid-1970s, and he wasn't particularly talking about that stuff then. It was something he had done, but it wasn't something that was sort of the center of his world in terms of what he was thinking about. But I mean, so from physics, there was kind of this idea of, this is an idealization of these complicated tensor expressions. But that had no connection, so far as I know, with category theory at that point, or any of those kinds of ideas.
So if you're talking about the maths now, like, it had no connection. And I mean, it didn't have any, it doesn't, personally, I don't think it necessarily needs a connection with category theory. Where the category theory comes in is, you can directly relate these tensor calculi to diagrams. Where the connection comes in, if you want to connect this to concrete mathematical models, like the stuff you learn, the set theory build stuff, then you need category theory. And actually, it becomes actually much more complicated. Once you throw in category theory in the picture, you have to sort of care about stuff like associativity. And so, I mean, if I've got 3 pens here, I got 3 pens here. I mean, there's 3 pens. Okay, if I do set theory, I have to care about, like, okay, I've got 2 pens and I put a 3rd one, or I got 2 pens and I put a 3rd one. Actually, that's the same thing. You have to start off saying all these things like that. If I put first these 2 and then these 2 and then I add the other one, that's actually the same thing. So then you end up doing these things like natural transformations and all this complicated stuff, with the result that if you read a category theory book like McLean, that you have to go to page 250 to actually understand what it means to have 3 pens.
Okay.
I mean, so I'm not sort of telling anybody, oh, you have to learn category theory to understand like what it means to tensor 3 things together. I mean, I went through that. I went through that trajectory myself because there was just no other math doing that. And I mean, and you couldn't publish a paper like saying, oh, I got 3 pens. That's very interesting. You had to go. And I mean, that's a cultural thing, which I think, since this is school, is important to say. We couldn't publish any paper if we did things diagrammatically. We had to write it down like category theoretically with the natural transformations and all the complicated stuff to get accepted to the computer science conferences.
Oh, really? So, but computer science.
Otherwise, it didn't look difficult.
But in computer science, people were familiar from the electrical engineering tradition for things like wiring diagrams. So they have seen diagrams.
That's a branch of computer science. We were in sort of the logic, computer science, semantic stuff. And there still people expected complicated theorems.
Okay, so it was a theorem-based area rather than a.
Yeah, I mean, it had to. I mean, it had to look complicated anyway. Like conferences like LICS, which are top conferences. I mean, you can come up with logic papers and stuff like that. It has to look sophisticated. Like a paper I sometimes write now, like, oh, you do this and this. It's all trivial. You don't get that stuff in. And so, to be honest, like the first categorical quantum mechanics paper by Sampson and me from 2004 or something, which is now a very, very renowned paper or something like that, but only in because there happened to be like a friend of us in the program company who pushed really hard because there was so much objection.
Where was it published? What was it in the computer science?
Logic and computer science, IEEE. It's like the main. I mean, there's this cultural sort of thing between like Europe and the US. Like in the US, it's all algorithms and complexity. In Europe, it's a lot more like, I mean, you know, the traditional Oxford stuff you were talking about, like combinator stuff and lambda calculus and sort of like more structural stuff, and Lix is the biggest one there.
But so in logic and computer science, at one time that was all about decidability theory, then it became sort of computational complexity theory. And what were the other, what did logic and computer science mean at the point when you were starting to talk about things like
this is still very much like the American sort of view, the model theory stuff. In Europe, you can, if you got, you can publish category theory stuff. Category theory stuff is pretty okay, like, and more and more and more, it's becoming more prominent even now. If you now go to this logic computer science conference, you see lots of diagrammatic papers now. It's becoming accepted. It's becoming accepted. They do this in signal flow theory and stuff like that, and it's exact. This stuff looks exactly like ZX calculus. They actually, every single of these papers refers to ZX calculus. It's just pure computer science about like engineering stuff. They all refer to ZX calculus because it's the same thing. There's no complex phases and stuff like that, but it's the same kind of equations. It's because they're so generic. the way I think about the sort of the way you notice this too. I know like the sort of work you do. You see, this is just generic stuff. There's not. ZX calculus, it was just there for somebody. Yes, I think write it down. Just for somebody to just write down, and it's just ridiculous that it was written down in the context of quantum mechanics.
Right. Well, I think these multi-way graphs that we study a lot, which is the same tradition. Yes. That has, these ideas have been rediscovered many times in many fields.
Exactly.
They have they've been, but I'm curious in the life of category theory. So category theory arose with people like Saunders MacLean from sort of the algebraic topology kind of, sort of finding a framework for describing these kinds of mathematical. How did that? That arose in the U.S. primarily, right? How did it?
Manhattan Project.
Which?
Manhattan Project.
I don't think those guys were much connected.
They, from what I understand, they were not much connected, but they were working there, and I don't know how much they contribute, but they wrote their first paper while they were actually like sort of taken there and to work on the Manhattan Project, because most scientists were. So
that surprises me because
look at the date, 1945. So they wrote this thing down. This is independent of. I'm not saying this had anything to do with the Manhattan Project, but they were actually there. And in the evenings, they did their work together, and they came up with
This is at Columbia. It's MacLean was at Columbia doing this. He was pulled in like everyone else at the time for the World War II effort.
What was he? I knew MacLean slightly.
You know better, right? Am I right?
What's that?
Yeah, I'm asking.
I don't think it's directly related, but you're right. They were part of the effort of the Manhattan Project as it was being done at Columbia. I don't know the details of what they did, but MacLean certainly was.
Something like that. I don't know the details.
The Manhattan Project was not only in Los Alamos, it was located in Los Alamos and at a number of universities, including Columbia.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a piece of history I didn't know, because I knew many of the physicists who worked on the Manhattan Project, and those people would have been horrified by category theory. They were all kind of 19th century mathematics type people.
This wasn't what they were doing for the project. They were just doing this in the evenings.
No, it's interesting. I'm
a hobby thing.
I do know that Saunders MacLean subsequently worked on a number of things related to things like cryptography and so on. Which was another branch of kind of American mathematics. But okay, so far as I know, at that time there was no connection between the category theory people and the physicists.
Nothing. At that time, category theory didn't exist. It was just that one paper, really. Category theory in itself, Okay, so that's a completely different story. Category theory, I think, sort of kicked off with Levere in the 60s. Levere was sort of the first one who actually started pushing the topic, but to the same extent, they kind of suffocated the topic. They were very sort of isolated. like self-imposed isolation, because they kind of like declared themselves disconnected from the rest of mathematics. Like they thought like what we are doing is so much better than what everybody was doing, and there was some sort of arrogant mentality, and that basically kind of suffocated the subject in the end. As a subject, as something like an alone standing subject in mathematics. What happened on the other hand is like people gradually start using bits and here and there of category theory, and that's how basically category moved on. So all the pure category theory groups, like when I was in the 90s, they were all dying out. Like all the big category theories, like Montreal and all that. There was like 15 people in Montreal. They were all just, I went to Montreal basically, like, and there was just all these retired people. There was no following up all. They were all, I mean, it was just completely dying out. But then category theory became sort of absorbed without like being like a subject in its own right.
So when it was a subject in its own right, was it connected to logic and things? Was that the
yeah, because of people like Dana Scott and stuff like that.
Okay.
I mean,
I don't think Dana was ever that serious about category theory as such. I mean, he, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's one of the many things.
Yeah, but that's what made. I mean, Jim Lambeck, like, is one of the pioneers of logic. Like, but these were like the loose category theoreticians. They weren't sort of part of the hardcore. Actually, Lambeck wasn't even taken seriously by the hardcore because he was like doing language and stuff like that.
What was so he came out of this tradition of what became categorical grammar and things like this, right?
He started this was in 57. This was before like 56, 55, 56. Before actually category theory, everybody knew about it. But, I mean, he kind of invented linear logic, for example, in his first grammar paper.
But so there was this tradition of, I mean, the idea of representing language, human language, in some formal way, which, you know, one might say dated back to, you know, antiquity with people like Panini and so on. But then in more recent times, I mean, most people would say that really got launched with Chomsky and the whole generative grammar idea in the mid-1950s. But as I understand it, this was a different strand. This was the Ajukowicz or whatever his name is.
Ajukowicz was earlier, huh? He was earlier, yeah.
Right, but he had that was a formalization. I mean, Ajukowicz to Lambeck was a different formalization of human language. Is that right?
I mean, it was kind of the same thing. It's like, when do you decide that like, when you take types, I mean, the idea is to assign types, and then it's very much like computer science. You assign types, and then you decide when is a sentence well formed, like types match and stuff like that. It's very much computer science idea, you know. And I mean, Ajukowicz started that, and Lambeck like really, I would say, like got it completely right for the first time, and then CCG and all that. People are still using all that stuff, you know, CCGs.
And that was that the Montague grammar business as well? Was that connected to all of this?
Montague, I think, is going to die, because Montague was basically like thinking of language as being true or false, and then trying to put it all in a logic framework. Exactly like we were talking earlier. You can't put all of language in a logic framework. That's what Montague did. But I mean, to some extent, people say, okay, Montague was a brilliant piece of work. But that's again what the machine learning people say now. Okay, that stuff is bullshit because we can't use it. And the reason we can't use it is because they put it all in logic terms. This was all like first order logic. All of language is first order logic. And the only thing we can decide on is whether something is true or false.
You mean as a semantic fact, which is, I mean, he was,
semantic fact. I mean,
yeah, well, that's hopeless.
When I tell you the sun shines, it's not about true or false. I mean, it means like you get heat on you, you know?
But so the stuff that the Lambeck tradition is more about, I mean, that's a more syntactic tradition of understanding how you put sentences together.
I mean, knowing Lambeck personally, well, like, I mean, for him, it was more a psychological thing. Like, how do we think? How does language work and stuff like that? And that's why during his life, he actually started to like denounce his own theory several times. And
that's like Chomsky. He's denounced his theory many times. Yeah,
yeah, like Wittgenstein.
But so what was Lambeck's idea? What was his kind of? Did he have sort of a model of human thinking that was mapped into his categorical?
I mean, he was not a person who sort of said a lot, but like the reason he sort of denounced is, this is about like particular categorical structure. So he denounced the Chomsky stuff with the trees, because it says we don't build trees in our heads and stuff like that. We as humans don't do this. Our thinking is much more basic than that. So he ended up with these pre-groups, which is basically just a bunch of wires between things, which is where we started. It looks like monoidal categorical diagrams. I would never have gotten into language if we wouldn't have done this, because otherwise, I mean, it looks too complicated for me, and I don't do complicated stuff. So it's just between like, okay, you got a transitive verb, you got an object and a subject, and they feed into the transitive verb, like, oh, that's it. It's like wiring circuits together. That was his sort of last.
What's the name of? Sorry, can you repeat the name of this particular academic?
Lambeck. L-A-M-B-E-K.
Jim Lambeck. Like, I mean, he's for me, he's one of the biggest category theoreticians ever. Like, I mean, categorical logic started with him, but he has this paper, The Mathematics of Sentence Structure, from 1956, which basically invented linear logic, long before Girard. So yeah, that's Jim Lambeck. Like, I mean, just for, because it's, I mean, I know it's like day there, it's late now, it's very late here, it's my evening. So I moved to Montreal for a postdoc after like my horrible career stuff I was talking about before, and I didn't have a place to live, so I just was squatting in Jim Lambeck's house for a couple of months. But I mean, he knew me from before because he had been to Brussels and he liked hanging out with me, and we were very close friends for like.
Was he a kind of a formal mathematical kind of person, or was he a more of a
ring theoretician? Right. So he has a very interesting story of life, because he ran away from Germany because of the Nazis and all that. So he was in jail for a long time because he thought he was a Nazi and stuff like that while he was a little kid. So it was 18, 19. And so he has a very nice, very beautiful life history there, the way he ended up in Canada and stuff like that. But he was a pure mathematician. And like the reason we used the symbol R for a ring is thanks to him.
Okay.
So one of the, when you talk to a ring theoretician, they still say that Lambeck's book from 1960 or something like that is the most beautiful introduction to ring theory. But so he was a pure mathematician.
But so when he was thinking about language and he was defining these rules for sort of how sentences would get put together, what did he think the output, were these rules essentially prescriptions for what sentences can occur? Or were
they never put sentences together. They put words together to form a sentence.
Fair enough.
They never got any further than that.
Okay, but when he was doing that, was he thinking it was like a grammar, like a context-free language or something like that, where it would define these are the sentences which are possible, these other sentences are not possible? Or did he imagine that there was more of a computation where it had a semantic, output from the sentence?
Never thought about that. I mean, he was thinking about that, but they never sort of realized that. He had this in mind to some extent. Now, when we start to do exactly what you're saying, because that's what we're doing, we took that stuff and then we saw that there was a lot of bugs there. Like the idea of a sentence, because these people had like something like a sentence type. And what is a sentence type? Like it's where everything exists. So if you take a type and you turn into something where actually stuff lives. So you go from noun as a label to noun as where stuff lives, noun lives. And you go from sentence to a label to sentence where stuff lives. I mean, it's too big. It's not something you can fit anywhere. So from our perspective, the idea of a sentence type was completely wrong. And in the sort of work we have been doing now recently, like there doesn't exist something anymore like a sentence type. It's only noun types. And for me, I mean, my slogan now about language is like a sentence is something which changes the meaning of nouns, which is a kind of a departure from what people in machine learning are doing, because meanings for them are static. For me, meanings are dynamical things. They constantly change. Like, I mean, if you read a book, what happens? Like, you learn more. Things change all the time. GPT-3 doesn't know COVID existed,
Yeah. Well, I mean, language is...
It doesn't know that.
But so in your interpretation, I mean, if we look at the set of all sentences that are being said today, they contain certain nouns. and you say the meaning of those nouns is defined by their context in the set of sentences that are being said today. Is that kind of the?
It's an evolving thing, like in physics. It's not a static thing. It's an evolving thing.
No, I understand, but
so for me, the noun is not a state. It's a type which evolves. Type is actually a good word in that sense. I mean, you start with nothing, you know nothing, and then you start saying things and it starts evolving. So the model of language we're building now is really like that, like circuits. Like you start, you have no knowledge, and then when the sentence starts, you start learning things. And you got a process where you learn things. And a sentence is like a gate, which changes the meaning of stuff. Now, another thing in the recent work which we did, I mean, it's that, I mean, I'm sorry to say so, because I love all the Lambek and all these people, but a lot of these structures they came up with, they're just artifacts of human disability. What do I mean by human disability? The fact that we can only speak one-dimensional. We can just say one word at a time. We're trying to describe something, the world around us. The world around us is not sequential. It doesn't live on a line.
I think the way we think is quite sequential, though.
You still think? You think that?
I think
That's
so.
an interesting conversation.
I think it's a fundamental feature. I think if that wasn't the case, I think we would conclude that physics was very different. In other words, I think that our sequentiality, our belief that there is a thread of time is critical.
Oh, thread of time, yes, totally. But one-dimensional. By one-dimensional, I mean like you just got event, like when we speak one word. We can't say words in parallel. That's a very different thing from non-sequential.
No, I think though that the way that people think about things is very sequentialized. That is, it isn't the case that, you know, when we try and do parallel programming and things like that, when we try and program, you know, we try and have languages that describe parallel computation and so on, it's pretty difficult for humans to understand how that works. And I think that's a...
So maybe you confirm what I'm saying. It's human limitation. Because the meaning of language...
Yes, I think so.
The meaning of language doesn't want to be one-dimensional. It's clear, it doesn't want to be.
I have to point out that Ted Chiang's story of your life, which is about Ted Chiang. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, Tally, we can. Yes, you can.
Ted Chiang's story of my life, which is about aliens that have a graph theoretic representation of language, is something that connects directly to what you're saying, Bob. And Stephen worked on the movie, so it's like a weird union.
Well, the movie.
What are you talking about?
No. So this was so there's a movie that was called Arrival that was based on this story, and the story is interesting because the story, even though I've strangely, well, the different story. The person who wrote the short story is a very reclusive person who I've never interacted with, so I can't say much about him. But it's about these aliens who don't have our standard view of time. In other words, in physics, for example, we are used to, there's a way of describing how things work by equations of motion, where it's kind of a mechanical process. We go from one moment in time to the next and so on. The alternative approach is action principles and things where we say, this is the path that will be chosen out of all possible paths. And that's kind of a not a sequentialized in time, or it seems like it's not a sequentialized in time approach. And so this story is about these aliens whose view of time is much more like an action principle. That is, it's a more holistic view of time rather than a sequentialized view of time. Right. And somewhat amazingly, this actually turned into a pretty good movie. I mean, the script of this movie, as you might imagine from the fact that it didn't have, in a sense, stories are narratives, which tend to be very sequential. I mean, the notion of narrative tends to be very sequential. So when you have a movie that is all about these aliens whose notion of time is not sequential, this is a very challenging thing. And I have to say the final movie that came out is really quite good, and it's quite a tribute to the director that he managed to put the whole thing together in a way that worked. What's that?
What movie is this?
It's called Arrival.
It's a Denis Villeneuve movie.
Yeah, right. Denis has now gone on to after Arrival. Arrival was like 4 or 5 years ago, and that movie was successful enough that he'd done a bunch of other successful movies before, but then he did the remake of Blade Runner, and now he's just about to bring out Dune.
Wait, Arrival. I think I saw it then.
Yeah, okay.
I think I saw it. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so that movie, my son Christopher was the main one who really contributed to that, because he wrote the code that is it's one of the only movies where the code you see that the quote scientists in the movie are using is actually the code that's producing the pictures in the movie, so to speak. Most of the time it's just, you know, a dump of some piece of Linux that go on the screen. But anyway, back to.
But I just want to clarify, the reason that I mentioned that is not so much the stuff about time. It's that the languages in that, the aliens in that original story, and this wasn't preserved by the movie because I think it was too technical an idea, but the aliens in the original story by Ted Chiang, it's a really good story. I recommend it to anyone here. They use a graphical language. So their language is not a linear
I remember it.
syntax.
I completely remember the movie. I've seen the movie. Yeah. I've seen the movie.
That gets simplified into a circle, but it's much more interesting in the short story.
Oh,
I've seen the movie. Now I remember. I've seen the movie.
Yeah, I actually don't remember that part of the story, Tally. I'll have to look at that again. But okay, so I mean, you know, I know just as a language designer, which is what I've spent a lot of my life doing, and Tally has worked with me for many years doing language design, so he knows this tradition very well. I mean, you know, one of the challenges in language design is what can the humans actually understand? And the fact is that I have long thought, can we actually have programs that are described as graphs and things like this? And it has been very difficult to get humans to understand things that are not essentially sequentializable. And that's
I get that. So, but there's one thing, like there's like, what can humans understand? And there is what actually is the essential stuff.
No, I know, I agree.
And how do you make a machine like reason with that efficiently? Those are two different things.
Right. But so what you would like to have is a disembodied notion of meaning. So you would like to.
That's what I'm talking. Well, I mean, it depends what you call disembodied. Disembodied in the sense like get rid of the sequential stuff, but we have to keep the embodiment because the thing still needs to realize that we live like in physical space and stuff like that. Like, because that sort of context you can't get rid of, right?
Well, I mean, my view of this is that the practical version of meaning is the ability to do computation. So for example, if you say you have a sentence, you know, Bob has a skeleton in the background, for example.
Only one or two. Okay.
You know, so the question is, what do can I turn that into a thing from which I can compute things? In other words, that's natural. So for example, in our Wolfram Alpha effort, we might say, something like, Bob is drinking this kind of whatever you're drinking, beer or something. I don't know what it is, or soda or something. Okay, and then what we can do, we would turn that into at least the soda part we can define very precisely as a computational thing. And we know it's this kind of soda and it has this amount of potassium in it. And it's a thing, it's a computationally describable thing that we can then know all these properties of it, and we can compute things about it. We can say, given that it was this volume of can, what's the mass of the soda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a way that we can anchor meaning for something. We say, if we can turn that natural language into something that is some computational construct that we can then compute from, that to me is an anchoring of meaning. And for example, if we say, Bob is drinking that drink, then you might ask, well, what can we do based on that sentence? What kind of hard anchoring and computation can we get from that sentence? So for example, you might have a contract that says, as the professor of whatever, you're not allowed to drink this kind of thing. And so you might have a definition, there might be a computational contract that says, as your employment contract might say, you can only drink this type of thing and that type of thing. And then what would be the place where the meaning would become sort of computational is defining. For example, let's say you're not allowed to drink alcoholic drinks, where alcoholic means more than X% made of alcohol or something. And then the point would be that that's where sort of the true meaning would come in, is because when you say this, you have this sentence that says you're not allowed to drink alcoholic drinks. Okay, what does that actually mean? It means this thing that can be precisely written as a computation that you can then go and run against a statement about the world and determine, did Bob drink the drink he wasn't supposed to drink, and so on. In other words, what I'm getting at is, what does it mean? How do you anchor, say another thing about meaning. So one of the things, before we did Wolfram Alpha, people have been talking about making question answering systems for 50 years. And they had always failed. And part of the reason was that they've been saying, we're going to understand language. And but the question was, what was the back end of that? What were they going to turn the understanding into? And the reason we were able to be successful is we already had this underlying computational language into which we could turn the natural language. So in other words, people who were abstractly trying to turn natural language into some abstracted notion of meaning, that just didn't work. Because the reason we could be successful is because we had this hard kind of anchor of that we have this computational language and we can compute things about the world from this computational language. And so my feeling is that this idea of an abstract notion of meaning that sort of floats around, I don't really buy that concept. I mean, I think that there's a sense in which we can do things like we can say, there's this hard anchoring of meaning in terms of computation, and then there's an exposure of that meaning as natural language, and that's a very fuzzy thing. And when you expose it in terms of natural language, and we say, for example, what's an alcoholic drink? Well, that might change over time. What counts as an alcoholic drink? It might be this percentage alcohol. It might be that kind of alcohol. It might be this, that, and the other. And that's something where there's fuzziness in sort of how that's exposed as a thing that we humans talk about.
The way I think about it is like, I agree with you, like that there is this, obviously you need something computational, but there is the difference between the top down and the bottom up stuff. Like is the meaning defined by what you can do initially, or is the meaning defined by what you can do potentially? Like when you say alcoholic drink, and you don't have enough context, it may mean nothing. Because obviously, like if I take some apple juice, it's an alcoholic drink. There's alcohol in there. So the alcoholism, alcoholic content depends on like the social context of who's actually going to sort of perceive it. And sort of the way I'm starting to think about meaning now, this is a new thing for me. I'm going to be honest. I've been thinking about meaning very reductionist for a long time because I didn't know anything about this. I was just a bloody physicist, right? I didn't know anything about it. I knew some category theory and stuff, but I was thinking very like we are physicists. You know this. You've been trained as physicists. We initially are trained as bloody reductionists. You have to fight that thing. You have to fight that thing your whole life because you're indoctrinated with that stuff. But now I'm actually totally getting into the idea like that stuff should come top down. And that's a new challenge. That's a new challenge. How do you do that? And that's a very new challenge for computation too, I think. Because computation hasn't been, math definitely has been, physics was never set up like that. Maths was never set up like that. Computation was never set up like that. So how are we going to do that?
Well,
can I make a comment?
Go ahead.
I'm not sure if we're supposed to just sort of be following, because this is a fascinating conversation, or if it's okay for us to interject some comments.
Well, by all means interject, but I think it's probably easier if you, I should look at all these chat comments that have come in, because we could try and address these. There's a whole flow of
wait, it's late. Can I go to Luke?
Yes. We'll see in a minute. Let's see. Let me look at some of these comments here. I'm going to try and talk a little bit more about compositionality, because I think I want to really understand what Bob, how Bob thinks about that, and what on earth does Bob have in there in his actual physical environment there. It's like a movie set behind him there. I'm kind of wondering about that, the skeleton with the attached live head thing. That's very odd. Perhaps
That maybe Sagan's face out there.
Satan, you think?
Sagan, no, Carl Sagan.
I would doubt that. We can
Yeah.
ask.
Yeah.
Oh, Ross
That one.
Duncan. Okay. Somebody who Bob works with. Okay, who hopefully is in better condition than the It's I guess we have to ask. Maybe we shouldn't ask Bob whose skeletons these are.
Well, do you remember that hilarious moment where Bob delivered his talk? We invited him to do a colloquium, and he delivered his talk, and the real sorry, what is his name of his collaborator
Ross
again?
Duncan, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, the real Ross Duncan was kind of masquerading as a skeleton for quite a long time, and then he
Yes,
popped up.
actually, I remember that. Yes, that's a pretty good piece of camouflage.
I'm back.
Okay. So actually, I'm.
Yeah, what time is it there now? It's like 4. What time is it there now?
Well, where's the there? Where there's probably about 35 people here, and they're all in different.
Oh, sorry.
So there are some people who are on the. For me, it is 5:30 p.m.
Okay.
For the people who are on this, okay. For somebody else, it's 2:30. For other people, it's 5 in the morning. It's we are inconveniently, we live on a spherical planet. It might be, this is one of these times when the flat Earth would be convenient.
Yeah.
No, I'm curious. I mean, we're talking a little bit about language, and I know that's a current interest of yours, but I really am curious about this whole concept of compositionality and how you view kind of this. We talked a little bit about this idea. Well, you're just starting to talk about top-down versus bottom-up theories of things, and I suppose, I mean, do you think that is a story that relates to this composition question, or you think that's an independent?
I mean, compositionality. I mean, it's a word. Like, as far as I know, the only person people who have properly defined this are linguists, and that's actually a definition which can't be. Which is not the way I use it in. Like a linguist, what do they used to say? Like the whole can be determined from the story of the parts and the structure. I mean, that's very much from Montague. It's very much Montague.
Yes.
But that's a story which definitely can't be maintained.
So for a linguist, their belief is that the meaning of the whole is derived from the meaning of the parts.
And the structure. I mean, that's an important qualification.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not as naive like, the 2 bits, you put them together. Like there's a structure, and then typically it means the meaning of the words, the grammar, and that gives you the meaning of the sentence, which to a certain extent is true, but as the way, I mean, it's something which you naively accept, I've accepted this naively for many years. But then when you start to do practical stuff, it doesn't work, because most of the meaning comes from the context. It's it's not by stupid little side examples. It's like there's so much meaning which comes like from the context, and it's both the context of the text, it's both the context of you being where you are, me being here, and sort of particular conversation we have. A lot of the stuff we say gets only meaning by the fact that we have this particular conversation now between the two of us. And
I'll make a very practical point, which is that I thought that context was going to be critically important in useful meaning. When we started building Wolfram Alpha, I thought we would have to know a whole bunch of stuff about the people who are asking, random questions of what's now in Syria and Alexa and these other places, right? I thought we'd have to know who's asking that question. Are they, what's their story? It turned out we needed to know for the kinds of questions that we're answering, which is a wide variety of kind of general knowledge type questions. You don't need to know much at all about the people asking.
Yeah, but I can understand it for general knowledge type questions, but like if I want to know whether you're now happy or not talking to me, I need to know a little bit more.
Yes, you do. Something like sentiment analysis is very poorly.
That sort of thing which I'm talking about. Like then it becomes a completely different ball game.
Right.
And,
but I think nailing that down. I mean, to me, one of the use cases that really helps nail that down is computational contracts. That is, if you want to, what's that?
Computational contracts. What does that mean? I don't understand.
Well, it means you write an employment contract, let's say, or you write and right now you would write that in English or legalese, but the idea is to write it in a computational language, and this is something that in the blockchain world. Smart.
I know. People have been trying to do that there. I've got some. You know Fabrizio Genovese.
Yes, I do.
He was a former PhD. I mean, he's the first one who told me, like, I spent 2 hours talking to Stephen Wolfram.
Right. Well, actually, and the story behind that is a charming story, because I was at I think South by Southwest, a kind of techie trade show type thing. Okay, and I'm wandering around this trade show floor. Actually, with my son Christopher, and there's one booth that somebody about doing advertising by injecting things into the upper atmosphere and having streaks of light in the upper atmosphere, and then the next booth is somebody with a giant robot, and then we get to Fabrizio's booth, and I say, "What do you do? What are you doing?" And he says, "I do categorification of Petri nets." And it's like, okay, that's very different from the giant robot in the booth next door. And I don't think Fabrizio particularly, recognized me or anything. And it was just so funny that somebody would say something like this in what was a technology trade show. And it's like then for many people who would walk up to the booth, that the statement, "I do categorification of Petri nets," would be a complete conversation ender. Anyway, that's a fun thing, but I think
he's a very sweet guy, like Fabrizio.
Right.
He was one of my.
But yeah, right. So I mean, I think he had an effort to. I mean, the real question is, if you take a standard legal contract which has various provisions, like you can do this, you can't do that. The question is, can you express that in a computational way? And perhaps some pieces of that will be. You might say Bob has to live within 10 miles of, the company headquarters, or and things like this. And I think that's a place where this, for a long time, when people have talked about natural language understanding, they haven't had a use case, and that means that it sort of flops around without really having, without having good definition. And so, to me, like this question answering thing that we've done with Wolfram Alpha is one example where natural language understanding has a use case, and computational contracts is kind of another important place where you get to take sort of statements about the real world and try and do things with them in a way where the meaning matters, so to speak.
So yeah, I'm trying to get to the understanding now of what natural language understanding means. Like, because I mean, understanding can mean I'm starting to understand what you say. Like, understanding just means like really understanding the logical propositional content. Is this
well, like, yes, but except that but then you're putting yourself in the box of logic, which I think we both agree is the wrong box.
Yeah, I know, but it's some sort of formal understanding.
Right? Well, right. This is what I've spent my life trying to build, is the target for that understanding, which is, the computational language that we've been building with our whole Wolfram language system and so on, is about representing things in the world computationally. And that to me, once we can represent the things computationally, we can do computations. We can use all of the apparatus that people have built with all the sort of algorithmic development and so on that's been done. And then, for example, if we have these computational contracts that, one contract says this, another one says that, we can figure out what the net implication of that is, or whatever it is. We can kind of, this allows us to actually, it's not just make deductions, because deduction sounds like logic. It's the raw material for computing with things. And so I think that to me, the real target of natural language understanding is convert natural language to computational language. And what I've done in the last 40 years or so is try and build up a computational language that can express many kinds of things. Not everything. I mean, an additional project is to do the kind of thing that people like Leibniz were trying to do with their sort of philosophical languages and so on, where you get, in a sense, a symbolic representation for everything, including, right now in our language, the drink that you're drinking, I have no doubt exists as an entity in our language, and we know lots of things about it, and we compute lots of stuff about it. The statement that you're drinking it is not one that is currently expressible in our language. And once we have that, once we are able to express that, there will be conclusions. Like, for example, if I don't know, we'll be able to deduce things. Like if you say, Bob is out he's doing a hike and it's this temperature and this humidity. And then Bob has drunk such and such an amount of water in this number of hours. And then we have some model which we can compute with about, Bob is going to be dehydrated at the end of the day or some such other thing. That's a place where we can take what is potentially a natural language description of Bob's been drinking a lot of, this number of bottles of water or whatever, and turn that into something which is then computational and which we can then, make conclusions from. I mean, that's my way of thinking about what is the target for natural language understanding.
I mean, your notion of the notion of computation, of course, very complicated to the extent that it's something decidable, because in a lot of these things, when you start thinking about the models involved.
But I don't think, to me, the story of computation is just a story of the following of definite rules.
Okay, so even if it's difficult, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. I mean, many things that, in Wolfram language, there are many functions. We have a function for solving Diophantine equations. In principle, that function cannot work. But in practice, it works, very, very often. It's useful.
I mean, that's what engineers always tell me. And that's the whole story of complexity. It's just worst case stuff. Just don't care about complexity because usually it's not the worst case.
Well, right? However, I mean, I would say that in my own efforts, this whole idea of computational irreducibility, this notion that you can't know the outcome of a computation without running through the steps, that's been an important conceptual idea. It's also an idea that I think at a philosophical level is kind of critical for making us feel good about our life, so to speak, because in a sense, if it wasn't for computational irreducibility, you would know the answer to Bob's life is 42. There's no point in leading the life.
I mean, I knew that a long time, so I'm happy.
Right, but I mean, this kind of concept that, that kind of, that you have to actually go through the steps to find out what the outcome is. That's a sort of story of computational irreducibility. That's a place where, in some sense, computational complexity is critically important to kind of the way that we perceive the world and so on. But I mean, I think we should let some other people ask some questions here. But I'm also I still want to get compositionality. We said the linguist's definition of compositionality, is not the one you're using. So tell me what is compositionality to you?
Okay, so I'm literally writing a paper this week because people keep on asking me. I say, it's obvious. I say always, it's obvious. Most of my life has been like, I mean, it's obvious. Like, so I'm writing down. I mean, I think these diagrams, which you are using now too, like
yes,
is Jonathan here somewhere? I mean, you can travel through them top down, bottom up. You can actually think of them as like building something. You can think of them in this decompositional ways and stuff like that. You can go from a bigger one, decompose it. That's for me what it means. I mean, I've got a few side conditions to the extent these things have to mean something. They need a counterpart in reality. They should be non-trivial, and that's about it. That's all you need to have like some sort of interesting story about reality. That's what I mean. And the link.
So let me break that down for a second. So I mean, in our world, one of the things we've looked at a lot of these multi-way systems, which are essentially diagrams built from rules. I mean, there is a definite rule, and that rule specifies how you can construct states and events and all this kind of thing. So the kind of thing you're talking about, I mean, there's a,
if I just talking about generation, right?
Of diagrams.
What I understand from your program, it's a lot about generation.
Well, I mean, in the following sense, that we're imagining that there are certain rules defined, and then we look at the consequences of those rules.
Yes,
and
it's
those rules.
You produce stuff.
Yes.
Producing stuff. It's about producing models of this, producing.
It's about producing the multi-way system that represents the history of the universe, for example. That would be an example.
Exactly. Like, I mean, it's producing a history of stuff.
Yes.
So the way I see it, I mean, that's one application. I mean,
okay.
The other one is like sort of the other way around. You get a picture. How do you understand it? That's not generation. That's like decomposition. That's the other way around. And I think the structure needs to be able to do both ways. And
well, this comes again to this question about what is understanding, what is meaning. So for us,
exactly.
Yeah, but so I mean, for us, one of the things that's interesting is, we think it's important to have an observer. In other words, we have this whole multi-way graph that represents all possible histories of the universe and so on. But the question of what we conclude about how things work in physics is a story of an observer embedded within that system and that observer's perception of what's going on. So that's the question of how the observer perceives what's happening in the system. That's more, I think, something akin to what you're talking about with understanding and so on. That's more the.
I think the idea of an observer is to some extent tied within generation thing. Like so you generate something, you observe. Well, maybe not. Suppose maybe you're right. Like maybe the observer observes something. Where did it come from? How do you decompose? So the structure. I mean, so you should have both at the same time. I mean, I don't think there is. I mean, this is now we're almost going religious. Like, I don't believe that there was a generation or there was some sort of reconstruction of. I mean, that's what we are doing as humans. That's like the black hole thing, the singularity thing. I think they should both come at the same time.
Well, I think that
there's no such thing as. I don't think there is a Big Bang, or I don't think there is a human reconstruction. I think it's all at the same time. Yeah, I mean, that's now a philosophical sort of thing.
Well, I think that. Okay, so let's take that apart for a second. So first thing is, I think time is real in the following sense. Computational irreducibility is a phenomenon which tells you that that there is something that is achieved by the progress of time. Time is not just a coordinate.
I completely agree.
Right. Okay.
Piro told me that. I agree.
Okay. So, but I mean, then the question is, when our experience of the universe is we are entities within the universe.
Yes.
So it's a slightly complicated thing to ask. When we experience the universe, we're essentially parsing certain features of the universe. The universe is full of complicated things going on that involve computational irreducibility. Yet when we understand the universe, we reduce the universe to something that is somewhat predictable to us. And we are sampling only some very small slice of what really exists in the universe.
Cool.
And the question of what we slice off, what kind of things do we pick out from what's there in the universe? And I think that's where you need some kind of theory of the observer to know what kind of things do we pick out. And that's where I think, for example, the sequentiality in time and computational boundedness of observers, I think those are the essential features of observers that are needed so that we pick out the things that give us the laws of physics that we perceive to be correct. So, I mean, in other words, as aliens, if we were aliens, we might be picking out completely different features of the universe. You know, I think an analogy in statistical mechanics, if we look at, you know, molecules bouncing around in a gas, we as humans just say, oh, we care about pressure and temperature. But some Maxwell's demon alien might be saying, you missed the point completely. What matters is these little detailed things that happen with these little swirls of molecules, and they work in this way and that way, and you missed the point. And so what I'm saying is that some characteristic of the observer, some essence of the observer is critical to understanding what features of the universe you pick out to make your physics about, so to speak. And I think that maybe, I mean, that may be related to what you're saying in the sense that you're saying you can't, I'm trying to parse this out. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure that your sort of philosophy of how, well, I don't get it quite.
No, I mean, I think to some extent it's true. Like, I mean, there's two stories there. I could say two different things about what you say, but to some extent, part of us creating the story of history, creating the story of history, is basically also like building it backwards according to our means. And that's what you're talking about the story of the observer. Mm-hmm. But I think it's, I mean, we usually in mathematics and everything we do and in computation, we sort of build things in one direction. We have to learn to build things in two directions. Like sort of, it's much more relational. Of course, I mean, relation is a stupid word, you know, like, but computation is very one directional, you know. You compute and then you start from the assumptions to result. We should come to some sort of
well, yes, I think what you're saying
system where they come both together, you know, like because it's not that the Big Bang created whatever followed. It's to some extent we are creating like our past. We are redefining our past, and these stories should start to come hand in hand. And we have to generate the maths which enable. And computation is very one directional.
Well, I think
most of it.
Right. I mean, this is the difference.
Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, because it's very intuitive. It's very intuitive what I'm saying.
Right. I mean, so for example, in our multi-way graphs, the whole, ordinary computation, whether you're running a Turing machine, a cellular automata, and, you know, a typical program, there's it is a sequential thing. You do one thing, then you do the next thing. You do one thing, it produces an output. You apply yourself to.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So the big difference in multi-way systems is you have a state. There can be many outcomes. Those outcomes produce other states, and then there's an entanglement between states because two different outcomes, a given state may produce two different states, and those two states may subsequently merge in this multi-way graph. And I think that's critical both in our formalism and in your formalism, this idea that you can have a branching of states and a merging of states. And I think that
time sort of vanishes, like in the ZX calculus thing, like for example, time vanishes. I think that's
I'm not sure I would put it that way. I think what happens is time is many.
No, you can put it in. You can put it in again. It's the way I think about it is like complex analysis. Like we know we're working on the real line, and then sometimes we go out somewhere, and then computation becomes much easier. And then we come back. You see what I mean?
Yeah, but I think, I mean, the way that I see multi-way systems, which I think is similar to this. ZX calculus I think is a little different because it's more equational, and multi-way systems tend to be more kind of single directional, as in they are generating.
Yeah.
But I mean, the point is that I think the difference is we usually think of time as being essentially one-dimensional. It's there's a thread of time. That's how computation typically works. In a multi-way system, there isn't a single thread of time. There are many branches, there are many fingers of time, and they branch and they merge. And that process of branching and merging is something that is, I think, essential to, the formalism that you've worked on a lot, the formalism that we're working on. I think it is.
Of course, I agree. Of course.
Right. But I mean, but one of the things that's interesting there is, in order to even know, okay, so computational irreducibility implies that an observer, or one can't know what's going to happen except by running each step. What multi-way systems imply is even to know what has happened at a particular moment is non-trivial, because there's no notion of this moment in time. There are many fingers of time.
I love that. I love that.
Right. And so
I love that. I mean, the Greeks would have loved that. Some pre-Socratics.
Yes. Right. But I mean, so the idea is that to define the state of the world, so to speak, you have to have an observer, you have to have something that can knit together these different fingers of time. You have to, you don't get to say at time t equals 10 or something, this is the state of the world. And so, in other words, there's this, and I think that forces you into this kind of, in order to deduce anything about the state of the world, you have to have a model of the observer. And by the way, this idea is, in a sense, there are two major precursors of this idea, which are general relativity and quantum mechanics, both of which needed, a non-trivial notion of the observer. And they are, and I think it is not coincidental that our models end up reproducing general relativity and quantum mechanics, because they are the theories that you get by making certain assumptions about observers within this kind of system that has this kind of branching, merging type thing. I mean, to me, the thing that I think you're going towards, and I think we're also trying to go towards, is to get this bigger understanding of these branching and merging type systems. How should you understand what's happening?
I think I'm going more top down, and you guys are going more like sort of, you're building it. Like, well, I'm just.
I want to understand this top down idea, because I mean, you're saying, let's take it, is linguistics the best example, or is there another good example of sort of?
No, I mean, for me, linguistics is a bad example. I mean, for me, I think linguistics was a very good place to look, because in the sort of the last paper, last things we have been doing, they're not out in papers yet, like we're still working on it, because I think we're sort of taking away everything from language, which is sort of language dependent. We're trying to look at the bare bones of language. When Chomsky was talking about universal language, nothing these guys did was universal at all. Like, we're trying to actually extract the real universal content on how we speak. Then we get some stuff out of it. And and what we get out of it, at the same time, we're now trying to build a model of space from the same structure. And so in my understanding of that is like the way language emerged was like from an understanding and interaction with space and stuff. Just physical space, not relativistic. Well, I think physical space, to be honest, is relativistic by default. I think Euclid did a brilliant thing, but Einstein just sort of said, yeah, okay, we've always...
Physical space, a crucial fact about physical space for us humans is, if I look at the environment that I'm in, or the environment that you're in, the speed of light is very fast compared to the speed that our brains operate at. So as far as we're both concerned, there is a notion, as we look around us, what we're seeing is a state of the world at a moment in time. It's okay to say that. We don't, if we, in other words, so, because it could be the case, if we lived, let's say we were the size of planets, then the speed of light really matters. And we could no longer say that, we could no longer talk about things in terms of successive moments in time. In fact, our model of computation that we have today that says things happen sequentially, one after another, we probably would not have built that model of computation if we were the size of planets.
I don't think like like in our sort of human perception, that light and stuff like that is essentially, I want to touch you, so I have to move to you and I touch you. And it takes me some time. I think like in our human sort of perception, like things take time. I mean, it's something we're indoctrinated with in school. First, that actually light. Anyway, that was a different conversation.
Yeah, okay, but yeah, where were you going?
I completely lost the plot now, because this is something which brings me back to my child. What you were just saying, I was thinking about this when I was 5-year-old. I was breaking my head on this sort of things when I was 5 years. So what I was just saying, I was talking about language, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yes. I was talking about language. So we're building this new theory of language, like beyond Chomsky and all that. I think we are actually doing something really novel there. I mean, I think we're doing the first novel thing about language in the past 50 years, to be honest. I actually, Montague was sort of a detour, I think. I think we have to go back to Lambek and stuff like that to actually get on the right path. And this is really like putting language in how we humans understand it properly, and taking away defects which are to do with like the fact that we actually have to speak sequentially and stuff like that, because, and then making it closer to a reference of the world. And the way I think about it now, about the structures we're seeing, they're like actually fundamental logical structures about the world. This, I mean, the reason language is the way it is, through this glass of these new structures we come up with, is basically like, yes, that's how we humans observe the world. That's our interaction with the world. That's why language is the way it is. The language, the way, like, you have to get rid of some of the bureaucratic stuff, like which is different in French, which is different in English, which is different in Persian, which is different in Chinese. Get rid of all this nonsense. Get to like the essence of the wirings, the essence in language, and then look at the world around us. And it maps perfectly. That, I mean, I don't know if this is any, I mean, this is stuff I'm working on now. Like,
well, so I must say that I find some of that I'm skeptical, because you know no, I think what you're saying, I think, is, you know, what I'm saying is there's this kind of computational language which can express lots of things about the world, and I understand that fairly well. It's a practical thing, you know, it's something we built, right? And it, you know, human natural language can be anchored in that computational language. But okay. I think what you're saying is that in a sense, okay, so here's a question. You know, if you just look at the structure of human language and you don't allow humans to do any experiments in the world, all you give them is a grammar book, okay? All you give them is structural information about language. Yes. Your contention, I think, is that from the pure way that human language is structured, that is the way it is because of things about the physical world.
No, okay. Totally not. I'm basically saying the opposite. And I'm saying that's the reason why machine learning, modern machine learning, when they try to actually put in linguistic structure, it actually fails. It's too complicated. What I'm saying is, like, there's a lot of bureaucracy in linguistic structure. If you compare like English, I mean, if you compare English with Persian or all that, like all these different language, they got lots of complications going on. So what we have been doing is trying to identify like what's really universal about it.
No, I get that, but I think what you're going, the point that I'm making is that I think that you know, when you say what's universal, there's in a sense the structure of the physical world, which is, you know, it has a certain form, and there is the structure that the physical world has, and then there is a description of the structure of the physical world. Those are two different things. And then there is the language that is our, you know, as you say, bureaucratically imbued version of the description of the physical world. And what I think you're implying is that there is a layer of description of the physical world which is below language, which is more universal than language, but which is not just the physical world itself. So the way I would put it is, there is the physical world, in our models of the universe, there might be 10 to the 400 atoms of space in our universe. They're all doing really complicated things. We humans don't care about what most of those atoms of space are.
I completely agree.
Right, so we're picking.
I'm not talking about like, I'm not talking about microphysics at all.
Right.
I'm talking about like, I'm talking about oh yeah, I completely agree with you.
Right, but so what?
I'm not trying to say anything reductionist here. Completely not. So what I'm talking about is like some basic mechanisms in the world, like a predator catching a prey, like very basic.
I understand. This is a
a few humans trying to take a mammoth down, and I think this sort of basic mechanism. I'm not talking about physics,
okay.
Like, so and I think language, as far as I'm concerned, is structured about this basic operation.
Okay, so I think you are following to the same trap as Aristotle. Okay.
Oh dear.
So,
I'm in good company then.
Yes. No, but I mean, in a sense, what Aristotle's actual objective is a little bit different, but he was trying to say there are these things in the world, and we can make a formal idealization of the things that matter in the world, right? So he's saying, there's a limited formal system, in his case, logic, that capture, right? And so people have, like the semantic web is a good example of a bad example, actually.
I agree.
Right, so the semantic web is another kind of, it's an ontology, with containment and all this kind of thing. It's a formal model of the world. So my observation about this is that what is one trying to do in building a computational language? What one's trying to do is to interpolate between human understanding of things and what actually exists in the world. And I claim that I don't think there's a universal model, there's a simple model that does that interpolation, because I think that capturing human understanding has a complicated historical foundation. That's, the things that happen to be discovered by this at this and that time, the things that developed based on the fact that we have two arms and things like this. There's a lot of very detailed stuff there. And so my belief in building our computational language, for example, has been that one shouldn't try to find the magic universal theory that reduces.
I completely agree. So I'm talking about something much more basic. I'm talking about like basic ideas like that if you got an action, you got an object, and you got a subject, and somebody generating the action and somebody stuff. And this is not even an absolute thing.
Well, right.
Sort of.
That's kind of it is a notable fact about human languages that they all have nouns and verbs.
That's all I'm talking about. These sort of basic things. That's all I'm talking about. And some of the things like the people like Chomsky and Lambic and got wrong is like they thought sentence type was some sort of different type. It was not. It was some sort of composite of nouns. It basically, a sentence type is whatever affects you in the sentence. And then you can kind of build up a completely different, it's much less ambitious than I probably made it sound initially. It's like just a slightly different, it's subtle, slightly different way of structuring. There is like no sentence types anymore. There's no universal stuff anymore. And then suddenly you get sort of a circuit model of language. It's very simple, it's very naive. And when you talk to people about it, and then like master students or students who never hear about it, they just get it. They just get it. You see, that's empirical evidence. Like I've been trying them, like turn this, you ask somebody like, put this sentence into some sort of Chomsky grammar structure or whatever. They have to study for that for half a year, Turn this into the circuit, I tell them, they do this in 5 minutes.
Well,
that's empirical evidence.
So, usually in kind of diagramming sentences, there are two different approaches, right? They're these, what are they called? They're these, oh gosh.
Yeah, there's a few approaches there, but we do it, the thing is, they're sort of like they're not as foundational as Chomsky stuff. You know what I mean? Like they're not sort of built up from. So we got a proper foundation there.
Right. I mean okay, but I mean I'm aware of. I mean this stuff that came from Jukowitz and Lambeck and all this kind of thing. This way of, what is it called? The thing where you put these, where you just connect words together.
Categorical grammar.
Right, but there's a different name for it in parsing. In parsing, there's the notion of constituent graphs, constituent trees, and then there's a different. I know we actually have a capability for doing this in our language, so I have to look up what this is called. It's what is it called? It is called dependency graphs. That's right.
Oh, dependency graphs. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I remember helping design those way back in the day.
What's that? Did you design that, Tally?
Yes, and I prototyped the visualization that we used there, I think.
So but I mean, so that's just been an approach that I think has fallen by the wayside. I mean, Chomsky's is a very tree-based approach to structuring sentences, and dependency graphs is a more, I mean, that's just connecting word. It's more like function application. It's more like the verb is a function of its arguments and so on.
Sure. So I mean, the main thing we're building now, it's like the idea of having sentence. A lot of these things are kind of sentence based. Like sentences don't make. I mean, for us, sentences don't even make sense anymore. It's like, because many sentences can be broken down in different sentences. Like lots of these traditions were all based about like the monolithic thing is a sentence, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. Like you tell a story, sometimes you say something in one sentence, sometimes you say something in two sentences. The idea of like having sentences, a monolithic unit, it's just, I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's
I think
about a story.
Look, one of the issues, I mean, sentences are a form of modularity. And modularity, I mean, one thing we've learned from the practice of computation is, that's the reason von Neumann, back to von Neumann, another thing von Neumann kind of got wrong was this idea that, a program would have to be a monolithic thing. And so he thought programs couldn't be very long.
Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Right. I mean, he didn't have this idea of modularization of programs. And I think sentences and paragraphs and so on are probably our, an important modularization for the practical processing of language by our brains. I mean, it may not be a necessary feature, just like you could write a program. You could write, any one of these programs we write, you don't need subroutines. You can just write the whole thing as one long string. It's just very hard to process by something with finite memory and finite computational capabilities.
I mean, I think part of the problem there is the linearity of how we speak, because we put it all in one line. We can't have like sort of higher dimensional representations of what we try to say, because our mouth can't do this, our ears can't process this.
We can draw pictures. We go. Right.
And then like probably we don't need to have this restriction to sentences anymore.
Well,
Steven Pinker has a very interesting point about this. One of his
excuse me,
and it was just a sorry.
Tally, you should go on camera so we can see, so you actually appear as.
I missed the beginning of what you said.
Oh, I was just saying that Steven Pinker makes a great point about this. It's one of his popular books on language, and the way that he presents it is that you've got a graph in your head, which is the meaning you want to communicate. It's a bunch of relationships between entities, and good writing is the art of choosing a walk in that graph that kind of captures as much as you can do, but it has good locality properties so that the working memory of the reader, of the listener, is always at the vertices that you've recently traversed in the last sentence or the last paragraph or whatever. And that just re-emphasizes that point that sentences aren't really relevant. Sentences are just temporary stopping points where you reach a bit of a dead end. You could just end up repeating something that you said before, and you want to take a new path through the graph to communicate some more information. And so you just have to stop a particular set of clauses, which were a little subgraph. And I quite like that. It was a very vivid way of And it accords with how I feel about what good writing is. It's really about navigating this abstract space of meaning efficiently.
That's interesting, although I think that in a sense presupposes, Tally, this kind of, knowledge graph-esque view of what meaning is, which I tend to think is not a particularly good approximation to what's actually true in the world. I mean,
probably not. And maybe hypergraphs are the way to update that idea to the 21st century. That would be interesting.
Although Sparkle and things like that do already have hypergraphs.
My understanding is that everything's triples in the end. So they do the same trick that you did early with the physics project, where it's just like, well, every graph you can turn it into a trivalent graph, but you actually lose a lot of ability to reason about complex things when you do that. You kind of miss the point.
But when you're talking about triples, you're talking about knowledge graphs, right?
We're talking about.
I'm not talking about triples, but
yeah, right. But what I was saying was that one attempt to, I mean, this knowledge graph idea sounds cool, but doesn't work in practice. I mean, that's basically.
I completely agree. Like,
doesn't in practice people do distributional semantics? Like, isn't there's a whole other way of thinking about meaning, right? Which is pioneered by these machine learning kind of these word embeddings and a lot of the recent ideas of machine translation. These are quote unquote distributional semantics, vector space based semantics.
But that also, and I'm curious what Bob thinks about this. I mean, the word to vec world of, let's have a vector space that represents meaning is, to me, the one example of, king minus man equals queen type thing or something, or plus woman equals queen. This kind of linearity to meaning space just seems completely wrong to me. And I'm curious what you think about this kind of the vector space embedding.
Okay. Let me put two. Okay, I can say two things about it. I completely agree. It's completely shit. There's nothing like meanings living in vector space. On the other hand, my only claim to fame in like anything to do with language is in that area, because like in 2008, nobody knew how to combine meaning and grammar. Now they don't care anymore. But at the time, actually, there was a question like, how can we combine meaning and grammar? And by using like our compositional approach, we basically took like grammatical structure on the one hand, like embedded like as linear maps in vector spaces. Like we took Lambda calculus, thought of it linear maps like in categorical quantum mechanics, like in teleportation and stuff like that. We put it together like meanings as vectors, and we had an algorithm to compute meanings of sentences from meanings of words. That's something we did in 2008. This got a lot of bigger. This was pre-deep learning, So we were on the cover of New Scientist and all that with all that shit. So
I'm always suspicious, New Scientist. I was amused to realize recently that I have.
But it's funny. Like that was the first time I got on the cover of like a major thing.
No, I was going to say about New Scientist.
Natural language, which I knew nothing about.
Right. This is, New Scientist is the only magazine where I have continuously subscribed to it most of my life. I've had a subscription for 53 years, I realized. But almost everything that it is a great read, but almost nothing that you read in there turns out to be real.
Exactly.
So
Bob, George Lakoff has written at length about things you've talked about. In fact, what you've been talking about sounds so much like a lot.
Can you go back again?
Okay. What you have talked about sounds so similar to a lot of things that George Lakoff and Philip Johnson Laird have been writing about a meaning of language being rooted in our embodied experience in the world, and
yes,
also about how the structure of language is largely built on mental models and metaphors, which can be highly parallel. So have you read those guys? Because they may have a lot to say that's relevant to exactly what you're thinking.
What can I do? Like I'm not building quantum computers and stuff like that. How much can a person do? Like, I also like to drink my beer, right? But yeah,
I don't. Yeah, I also have copies of those books, and I also have never really understood them.
How do you? I know Steve. You know so much. Like, how do you do that? Because I don't. Why do you read? When do you find time to read that stuff? I don't know. Like, I mean, I mean, that's just like a personal question. Like, how do you
I'm
do
also
that?
very curious about the answer to this question.
What, you're asking, who are you asking? You're asking me?
Yeah.
Look, it becomes easier. I have a good memory, and it becomes easier to learn things after you've learned a lot of stuff already, because things fit together. And that's so it becomes ever easier to learn new things. That's my basic answer. I mean, but I think, but now I'm curious.
I'm asking about the reading, to find time to read.
I don't read very well, I must admit. I'm not a great.
I read nothing.
Yeah, well,
I can't do. I mean, I built like this big group at Oxford University, 50 people. So I'm dealing with admin bullshit and stuff like that. I used to deal. I mean, I can't read anything because if you want to have some time to create, you just don't have time to read. That's the sort of position I found myself in.
Well, see, that's why now that you're a company person, maybe you'll have a different kind of structure. Actually, I have to, since you're now in the quantum computing business, I have to ask, I mean, have you been involved much in kind of the physics of how quantum computers should actually work?
I don't know whether you noticed this, but like recently we sort of absorbed part of Honeywell. So as the senior scientist, I'm supposed to understand that stuff now.
Yeah, you know, I saw that you guys were caught in the gravitational, you know, well of Honeywell, so to speak, which is a fine company.
Actually, it chopped off from Honeywell, and then so I'm still in charge of the science, so nothing changed for me. So that's kind of cool. But I probably need to know more about ion traps now soon. I mean, I kind of know something about them because I used to do these things in Oxford, like next door to where I used to be. So that's a good thing. So yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, I've been closely involved. I mean, actually, I've been pushing an experiment from like a year and a half ago with like the optics people, because that's where I think in the long term the future is optics. And
so that's your bet for the implementation technology for quantum computing is optical.
I mean, that's the thing I understand best. I mean, this superconducting stuff, ion traps, like I vaguely understand superconducting. I mean, I'm just talking about understanding. I'm not talking about trust. I'm talking something that my mind can actually understand. The optic stuff, I'm pretty good at, because I've been very close to like the Zeilinger group in Vienna for many ages. They were like one of the biggest quantum foundations group. Like, I've spent so much time there. I'm friends with Zeilinger, and so I know all this stuff. Like, and so we're doing experiments with them. And then if you companies like PsiQuantum, like Terry Rudolph in I don't know whether they're actually the people personally I know the best and stuff like that. They're doing this secretive thing there. I hope that's and they're doing measurement-based quantum computing, which is really measurement-based quantum computing.
I mean, they're using technology. I mean, this is using microprocessor manufacturing technology for quantum computing. I mean, that's at a practical technological level, that seems to be the one.
I mean, the conceptual level is much more interesting. Like, they're doing measurement-based quantum computing, which means like they don't do unitary gates and stuff like that. It's just like only observing.
So why is it quantum? If it's all observer, why is, I mean, doesn't the observer?
It's quantum measurement.
Yeah, but what?
Teleportation. It's like teleportation. You alter the state by observing.
Okay.
And you get a universal computational model, and it's by nature much more fault tolerant, because everything happens like much quicker. So that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. PsiQuantum, like.
But so it's still a time-based. It's not like D-Wave, for example, where it's a.
Oh, nothing to do with that. D-Wave is like this evolution thing. Like, it's not. No. Measurement-based quantum computing in optics is like you just got one huge entangled state. Everything is encoded there. Everything is there. There's nothing else, and then you start observing. And then you got some sort of protocols, which is mainly classically processed, how the different observations should affect the next observations. It's a super cool model of computing. There's nothing classical like that. Completely different story than, I mean, for that reason, I think that's the way to go. Because, I mean, my idea about quantum computing is, I mean, when people say like, can we do things better with quantum, which we do classically? I mean, that's wrong. That's the wrong mentality. Like, what can we do new, which is completely different? That's the right question.
So what kind of computations do you think will be possible that have been a different definition of computation than's been used for classical computers?
I mean, the measurement-based stuff is by default a completely different computational model. And the only thing people have been doing is trying to compare it. But
I mean, the problem is when we use technology, computation or anything else, we use it for whatever purposes we humans have, so to speak. So to say it can do something different is, unless we can map that onto something which has some human purpose, it doesn't really work as technology, so to speak. So I mean, the question would be, what's an example of something? Let's say I have one of these psi-quantum boxes on my desk. What magical thing can I now do that I couldn't do before?
It's a good question. I don't know. And okay, that's exactly the point. I mean, there's lots of stuff we're doing now that I didn't imagine 30 years ago we would be doing now. I mean, maybe it's different for you. Like the world as it looks now looks very different to me than I imagined when I was like a 10-year-old kid. I mean, I was thinking about spaceships and going to Mars and going to other planets. I wasn't thinking about like a laptop. I wasn't thinking about like you know, mobile phones. Like I wasn't thinking about.
I think one of the things that's a challenge is, you know, your and our kind of model of sort of multi-way computation. The question is, what are the human useful use cases of multi-way computation? So, you know, we've understood, you know, Turing machines. We understand, you know, there's a giant tower of utility that we built there. Although, well, so to give you an example of kind of a weird case, right? So my computational irreducibility concept, you know, when I originally started talking about that in the 1980s, I wasn't sure where that will be used, right? Turns out it's got this big use case in the crazy idea of proof of work for cryptocurrencies, right? So it's a crazy use.
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, when I'm talking to I mean, just as a stupid example, like when Ross Duncan and when I started to do categorical quantum mechanics, we had this like pamphlet, high level quantum programming language or something like that. Where it's now used is like low level, like quantum like compilation, like optimizing gates. That was never part of the plan. It was never part of. I mean, of course it's good. I mean, it's not that. I mean, you know, the intention was high level quantum computation, like programming.
But what would that do? What would I mean? So in other words, my question is, because you know, this is in a sense, you know, again, in my lifelong activity of language design, the big question in language design is, what do people want to do? Once you can define functionally what people want to do, the implementation is challenging, but it's a very definite path. And the question is, what do people want to do? So given a quantum computer, like, what can we imagine doing with a quantum computer that is somehow, you know, something we care about, but is something different from what we've imagined doing before?
But this is a question to you. Whatever you did, I mean, I remember I had to learn Mathematica as a physics student and all that. Like when I had to learn Mathematica as a physics student in the early 90s, whatever you're doing now, did you imagine that that was something people cared about?
Which aspect of it? The things that...
Whatever you're doing now, whatever you think now, I produced in the last, I mean, this was early 90s, I think I was...
Right, well, so for example,
whatever you did in the last 30 years, did you think 30 years ago, that's something you were actually shooting for?
So the real answer is I wrote down a to-do list in 1991. We finally finished that to-do list a few years ago. About half the things I've done were on that to-do list. The other half were not. So in other words, so half the things I think were kind of, you know, they were on a path that was predictable, and half were things like, you know, something like blockchain. I didn't predict
exactly.
And you know, I think that, but there are certain trends that I think, I mean, this idea, for example, the idea of thinking about things computationally. I mean, that idea, I've known that idea is going to sort of take over the world for 40 years or more, right? That idea inexorably is what's going to happen. Anything that can be sort of made computational will be made computational. And that's been an unsurprising sort of trend of history. I think that, you know, for example, in recent times, the biggest surprise to me has been, well, the fact that particularly with these multi-way systems and things, you know, I started looking at multi-way systems in the early 1990s. But I thought they were interesting, but the central role that they're now playing in our models of physics, and I think that I have this increasing belief that there's sort of a paradigm for science. So okay, my latest kind of gloss on the history of science, which I've been, I think, mentioning a few times this week to our students here, but is, you know, I'm sort of identifying 4 epochs in the history of science, and that have to do at some level with the treatment of time. So in sort of ancient Greek times, it was like, what's the structure of the world? You know, is the world made of icosahedra? Is the world made of epicycles? Whatever. There's no time involved. It's just, what is the structure of the world? Then you get to the 1600s, and it's like, let's write down a formula for how the world works, and time is a coordinate, and we can just sort of pick what time we want to choose. And then in kind of my sort of efforts with my whole new kind of science stuff and exploring the computational universe, the big point is time is computational, and the progress of time is the doing of computation, and that leads to all this computational irreducibility stuff and so on, and that kind of gives you a new set of things that you can talk about scientifically, a new set of, you know, complex phenomena and so on you can talk about scientifically. What I'm sort of realizing is sort of the 4th epoch is this kind of multi-fingered time world of multi-way systems, where instead of having, you know, where in a sense there's this kind of multiple threads of time, and to even know what's happening, you have to have some way in which the observer is knitting together these different threads. And my belief is that a whole bunch of areas of science have kind of been waiting to get a theoretical foundation, have been waiting for an understanding of that kind of setup. And so, you know, I think, I mean, linguistics is one that I don't understand how this relates to, okay? So I've been looking at metamathematics, at chemistry, at biology, at economics, and these are places where I kind of have the suspicion that that kind of approach is the right sort of foundational way to think about models in those areas, because, you know, it's like some systems are well modeled by epoch, you know, by the epoch from antiquity. They're well modeled by just saying, what's the structure of the system? How is it made of things? Other things are well modeled with equations, where you can just say, you know, that you can sort of slide along the time just by picking its value in a formula. Other things get modeled by programs and cellular automata and all this kind of stuff. That but then there are a class of things that I think include a bunch of things in physics, a bunch of things in areas like economics, biology, chemistry, which I don't think have been well modeled by these sort of previous views of how one does modeling. And I'm sort of hoping that this I don't yet understand it very well. I don't understand how to think in terms of these multi-way systems, and that's why, you know, that's why in terms of reading, I'm sort of hoping I'll actually get a chance to read this thing. But you know, and I want to understand this. You know, I'm trying to take this kind of what I think you're referring to as a kind of compositional approach, and trying to understand how do we turn that into something that we humans can, for example, use in a computational language and kind of think in terms of.
I mean, that's exactly what I'm doing, as you know. Like,
Oh, right. Well, that's why I want to talk to you. I mean, that's
what I'm doing. Like, and I mean, I don't have the questions to everything, but I mean, I see the fit, and I know, like, I mean, we've been communicating a lot, like, I mean, through Jonathan and all that, like, because.
Right. But I think one of these key issues is, for me, this kind of way of thinking about things, which is related to the whole quantum computing, the sort of quantum concept of computation, more so than whether it's ion traps or photons or anything like that. This idea of multiple threads of history, so to speak. And my question is really, I can see in some of these science areas, I can see how those ideas can be applied scientifically. I am really curious to understand how they can be applied technologically, and I haven't understood that. And what I think is the case is that there should be a way of thinking about distributed computing that makes use of these kinds of ideas and that leads us to very different use cases for distributed computing. I just haven't figured out how that works. And I think, for example, the concept of, how do you program a distributed system? Because people right now, they try and sequentialize distributed systems. They say, let's use locks and things like this to make sure that you don't, and that's, a lot of this theory that we were talking about before of the kind of Tony Hoare, Robin Milner theory is all about how do you not get the system all tangled up by things happening in parallel and not knowing what happened before what. And so the question is there a way of actually thinking about computation so that you don't have to untangle it, so that you can really think about it at the level where it's still tangled, so to speak? And how do we think about that? And then what kinds of new technological possibilities are there if we can sort of think about things in those terms? I don't know the answer. I mean, this is the.
I don't know. Like, my gut feeling is that whatever the answer is to that question is like going to be much more than what you're asking for, to the extent that like it's going to be a revolution. It's going to completely change everything. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this because I don't.
Well, right. But so one of the questions then is the thing that comes out. Will we humans actually understand the stuff that comes out? Because it's not obvious. I mean, we can have a great civilization of AIs that work by using.
Okay. I mean, what does understand mean? I know you got natural understanding software already around. Like, what do we mean by understanding?
Yes, well, that's a good question. I mean,
there's so many different levels of what we mean by understanding. I mean, obviously, whatever is happening in machine learning now is like dumb, as idiotic as it can be.
Well, it's been, look, it's a methodology which I think has largely plateaued at this point. Not completely plateaued, but
it's completely plateauing.
Well, I think
my wife is just watching it. I introduced my wife. She's going to say hi to you. Just sitting here. Now you have to
let's come into the frame. We saw only the hand.
You have to come closer.
Hello there.
But I quickly go to the loo. You can say hi.
Oh, okay. You're being put in place. So are you a technological person or scientific person or something completely different?
I'm in science. I'm an educational neuroscientist, but not a computer scientist. What do you mean by science and technology? Of course, we use different kind of technology like EEG, like fMRI, this kind of things.
You said educational neuroscience, or
yeah, it's an emerging field. Actually, there are a few centers in the world. One of them is in London, Center of Educational Neuroscience. The other one is based on Harvard. The other one, there are some little groups in Bristol, in Europe.
I have a friend named Terry Sinofsky, who's one of the sort of early computational neuroscience people. Terry Sinofsky wrote this course about a sort of neuroscience-based course about learning how to learn, which he's very proud of the fact that he just released a new version of it. And he's very proud of the fact that it's a top-rated course on Coursera and so on. I'm afraid I think it may be kind of nonsense, but it's a kind of it's how to use neuroscience to learn how to learn, so to speak. I think
all the idea of education is about learning how to learn.
Yes.
not sure about neuroscience. That's true, actually, because as compared to the theory of education, neuroscience can be defined as it's in its infancy.
Yeah, but I mean, well, do you think there's a theory of education? I mean, in other words, if there's
there are two different theories of education. But yeah, actually, some people think that education is not science. Some people think that education is a kind of proper, well-grounded scientific field. I believe that my previous PhD was on education. So I always defend education is the proper scientific field, of course, and there are lots of theories. So the involvement of economy, sociology, psychology, philosophy. So of course, education expands its borders. But yeah, we can talk about so many different theories.
Well, the question is, in the modern technological world, there are lots of new things that people have to learn in order to work in the, in order to operate in the modern technological world. One of the things that seems not obvious is it could be that the world gets more and more complicated to the point where it is impossible for somebody to learn enough to operate in the world. But somehow we managed to organize our world so that we abstract enough away that the amount we have to teach doesn't expand. There was a time when you'd have to, in order to use a computer, you'd have to know how electronic circuits work, but we don't have to know that anymore. And somehow we managed to keep it finite.
The main, if you draw a kind of developmental line from educating through learning, so learning kind of takes its way towards forward, because the concept is not educating anymore. The concept is learning. More emphasis on learning. How can we improve people's capacity to learn or understand or self-educate themselves? Because I am one of the people, I believe that we cannot teach.
Okay, that's a somewhat controversial, right? In fact,
Sorry, I just
now we can continue we all have to go soon, but
okay.
I think this this question about whether let's see, interesting. Okay, well, that's a whole different
Okay,
topic.
We need to organize another talk. Then we need to discuss.
Yes, right. Well, that's a very interesting question. Whether learning is actually possible, or whether
learning is possible, but teaching is not, until the person allows you.
So now the question is, but are you a professor, for example, whose business is
I'm
teaching?
a docent. Docent, what is this?
Docent.
Reader in education.
Yeah, okay.
But I do research at UCL now. Yeah, we can discuss.
Another time. Maybe one day we'll meet in person. That would be fun.
Yeah, hopefully.
Anyway, well, let's see. I think we should probably wrap up soon, because I know various people have been asking questions here, and I'm not sure if I can.
Can I ask one quick question, just to get my head straight? So this foundation of quantum mechanics, right? It's from a very different perspective from how I encountered it. And so my question was, like, when I first learned about quantum mechanics, solving Schrodinger's equation, particle in a box, then learning about, okay, it's not actually Schrodinger's equation, it's this field theory that we quantize and blah, blah, blah. And so to me, that was quantum mechanics. And it feels like what you have been talking about is totally different, but related. And how do you move from your foundations to the foundations that we see kind of experimentally with PDEs and field theories? And
there's no different in foundations whatsoever. It's like different focus. Quantum mechanics was like basically what are people doing in CERN, and how can we predict what's happening in CERN in the previous century. Then people start to do tabletop experiments, the new centuries, and there was this sort of like I mean, I remember this, like in the previous century, there was sort of arrogance. If you didn't do infinite dimensional stuff, if you didn't do field theory, you were actually doing nothing. You were sort of like a loser. And whatever happened in the last like 20, 25 years, people started to discover completely new things that you can actually do with, which not new things, like new things you can prove and derive from quantum mechanics, which have nothing to do with infinite dimensions, which have nothing to do with field theory, which have nothing to do with CERN, which are completely new things people never thought about. Which, I mean, the first one to do so was John Bell, of course. Like
who was at CERN, by the way? Just as a footnote.
At CERN as an engineer, as an engineer doing wires. He wasn't
accelerators. Yeah, accelerators.
Something like that. But he was but no, I mean, it's very nice to see sort of the citations to his papers over the year. Like for like 30 years, nobody cared about that paper. And then boom. Then suddenly, boom, people thought, oh, that's actually relevant. And now this is the foundation for, I mean, whether it happens or not, I don't know. But like new quantum cryptography is just based on what you, I mean, we were talking about quantum foundations earlier and people screaming at each other about the interpretations. That guy was not screaming about interpretations. He came up with a theorem and how this became practically useful.
Right.
And then, I mean, that's sort of the big shift in quantum foundations. People are now thinking about things and at the same time thinking like, I mean, it's sort of something which happened in my life too. Like I was sort of like, when I started in physics, I was thinking about like, how should we understand things, blah, blah, blah. But it was kind of disconnected from the idea, like, if you understand things better, will it be useful? And I completely shift my mindset now. If it's not useful short term, it's bullshit. I think we can agree on that one.
it's a good, technological driving things from whether it's technologically useful is.
Exactly. I mean, now that's how I'm talking to my people. That's how I'm talking to my students. Still have students, by the way. Yeah, I'm still supervising, So yeah.
The thing that I found interesting, I mean, I don't know what your experience has been, but I managed to, in my life, I've kind of alternated between doing basic science and doing technology. And I've been sort of pleased by the extent to which sort of the technology enables basic science, the basic science informs what you can do in technology.
I'm completely with you now.
One of the big surprises from our physics project now is that I thought this was a pure basic science project, but it's ending up having all kinds of, its formalism particularly has all kinds of implications for these kinds of things we've been talking about. Anyway, we should probably, it's getting very late for you, and it's and I have another meeting in a few minutes, so I've but
it's pretty long. It was 3 hours.
Yeah, right. Well,
longer than the previous one.
yes. Well, it's that proves there are interesting things to chat about. I think that well, we shall have to continue at another time, and so everybody, we'll for folks who are at our summer school, I think we've sent out a number of links to Bob's work, and you can find out more about what you should have asked or something. All right, we should wrap up here. So thanks very much, Bob, and
thanks,
see you another time.
Talk to you again.
Yeah, it was fun.
We should do this again.
Indeed, yes. All right, see you later. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.